There's a house on Dunbridge Lane that no one ever talks about. It's not abandoned, not falling apart, not even particularly spooky looking. It's just there. A perfectly ordinary brick colonial with neatly trimmed hedges and a slate gray roof. But if you live in my town long enough, you'll notice something strange about it. The house changes hands every year. Always a new family, always under odd circumstances. The last people to live there were the Griersons, a retired couple who moved in last spring. They hosted a neighborhood barbecue in June, friendly as could be, but by September, they were gone. No moving trucks, no goodbyes, just an empty house with a for sale sign staked in the front yard. I never gave the place much thought until I became the next tenant. It wasn't intentional. My lease was up, and I'd been priced out of the apartments downtown. When I saw the ad for the house, I couldn't believe how cheap the rent was, less than half the going rate for a place that size. I figured it was just the market finally working in my favor, so I signed the paperwork and moved in without hesitation. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not a bad smell. Nothing rotting or moldy, but something faint, almost metallic, that lingered in every room. It reminded me of the air after a thunderstorm. I chalked it up to the house being closed up for a while and opened the windows to let in some fresh air. The smell faded but never fully went away. Then there was the mirror. It hung in the upstairs hallway, a large, ornate thing with a heavy brass frame. I didn't remember seeing it during the walkthrough, and I certainly didn't bring it with me, but there it was. At first, I thought it might have belonged to the Griersons, something they left behind in their rush to leave. But when I called the landlord to ask about it, he sounded surprised. "There shouldn't be a mirror in the house," he said. "We clear everything out after each tenant. Must be something the movers missed." I offered to take it down, but the moment I tried, I felt an overwhelming sense of nausea. My hands trembled, my vision blurred, and I stumbled back, clutching the wall to steady myself. When the feeling passed, I left the mirror where it was. The next few weeks were uneventful. I settled into a routine, ignoring the faint metallic smell and the mirror as best I could. It wasn't until late one night, after I'd been living there for a month, that things started to go wrong. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping. It was so soft I thought I might have imagined it, but then it came again. Talp, talp, talp. It was coming from upstairs. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the house settling, but the sound didn't stop. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and crept up the stairs. The tapping grew louder as I approached the hallway, and by the time I reached the mirror, I realized it wasn't coming from the walls or the floor. It was coming from the glass. I shone my flashlight at the mirror, and my stomach turned. My reflection wasn't moving. I stood frozen, staring at the image of myself staring back at me. Everything else about the reflection was perfect. Same hallway, same dim light, same phone in my hand, but my reflection stood stock still, its eyes locked on mine. And then it smiled. It wasn't a natural smile. It was too wide, stretching far beyond what should have been possible. The skin at the corners of its mouth cracked, dark lines spidering across its face, but the smile didn't waver. My phone slipped from my hands, the light spinning wildly as it hit the floor. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was gone. I ran. I didn't stop until I was out of the house, standing barefoot in the middle of the street, gasping for air. The neighbors' lights stayed dark. No one else seemed to notice my panic. I spent the night in my car, parked 2 blocks away, too scared to go back inside. The next morning, the mirror was gone. I searched the hallway, the bedrooms, even the attic, but there was no sign of it. The metallic smell was stronger now, seeping into every corner of the house, but the mirror had vanished. I convinced myself it had been a nightmare, a trick of exhaustion or stress. But then the dream started. Every night, I found myself back in the hallway, standing in front of the mirror. My reflection was there, smiling that impossible smile, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. In the dream, I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't run, just stood frozen as it reached out, its fingers pressing against the glass from the inside. Each time I woke, the metallic smell was stronger. One morning, I found something new, a crack in the upstairs hallway wall, running vertically from floor to ceiling. It wasn't there when I moved in, and it wasn't like any crack I'd seen before. The edges were smooth, too clean, and there was something dark seeping out of it, a thick black substance that smelled faintly of iron. I tried to call the landlord again, but my phone wouldn't connect. Every time I dialed, the line went silent, followed by faint static. My texts wouldn't send. Even emails failed to go through. It was as if the house was cutting me off. The next night, the tapping returned. Louder this time, echoing through the walls, the floor, the very air. I lay in bed, clutching the covers, as it moved closer. I didn't need to look to know it was coming from the hallway, from the spot where the mirror used to hang. The smell was overwhelming now, filling my lungs with every breath. And then, just as the tapping stopped, I heard something else. A voice, low and guttural, coming from the crack in the wall. "Let me out. I don't know what's in the house. I don't know why it let me live there for as long as it did. But I do know one thing. I won't be the next tenant it drives away. Because it doesn't want me to leave. It wants me to stay." Let's start a new story. Isolated in the kind of nowhere that makes you forget the world is even turning. My parents used to drag me there every summer when I was a kid, claiming it was good for me. Fresh air, space to run around, the whole wholesome package. But even as a child, I knew something wasn't right about the place. There was an emptiness to it, a silence that felt too intentional, like something was holding its breath. My uncle was a wiry, sun-leathered man who barely spoke. His only companions were a three-legged dog named Murphy and a herd of sickly cattle that grazed the fields like they'd forgotten how to live. I never saw him smile, never heard him laugh. He just worked, morning, noon, and night, always fixing fences, tilling soil, or hauling rusted equipment. He never seemed to get ahead. It wasn't until I was 24, years after I thought I'd put the farm and its memories behind me, that I found myself there again. My uncle had passed away suddenly. A heart attack, they said, though I'd always figured him for the type who'd live forever just out of sheer stubbornness. My parents asked me to help clean out the house, and since I was between jobs and out of excuses, I agreed. I arrived late in the afternoon. The farm looked the same as it always had. Dilapidated barn, rotting porch, fields stretching out under a gray sky. But it felt different too. Wrong, in a way I couldn't quite place. The air smelled faintly metallic, and the silence was deeper than I remembered, as if the land had sunk further into itself. The house was full of the kind of junk you'd expect from a man who lived alone for 40 years. Old tools, stacks of yellowing newspapers, jars of unidentifiable liquids. The attic was the worst. A cramped, dusty space crammed with boxes and crates that smelled of mildew. I spent hours sorting through the clutter, tossing most of it into trash bags. But then I found the box. It was tucked into the farthest corner, half buried under a pile of frayed tarps. At first glance, it looked ordinary, just a plain wooden crate with rusty nails holding it together. But when I tried to lift it, I felt a resistance like the box didn't want to be moved. The wood was ice cold to the touch, colder than anything in that stifling attic should have been. Curiosity got the better of me. I pried the lid open with a crowbar, the wood splintering as I forced it apart. Inside was a single object, a key. It was huge, almost cartoonishly oversized, made of blackened metal that felt impossibly heavy in my hand. Its surface was rough and uneven, covered in grooves that almost looked like letters, though not in any language I'd ever seen. The air in the attic seemed to shift as I held it, the silence growing heavier, thicker. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but unmistakable, the acrid tang of burning hair. My stomach churned as I scanned the attic, half expecting to find smoke curling up from some forgotten corner. But there was nothing, just me, the key, and the oppressive weight of the air. I should have put the key back. I should have nailed the crate shut and left the farm that night. But I didn't. Instead, I slipped the key into my pocket and went back downstairs, telling myself it was just a strange keepsake, nothing more. The first night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Murphy, the old dog wandering the house. But the steps were too deliberate, too heavy, and they echoed in a way no dog's paws ever could. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The steps moved slowly, methodically, from one end of the hallway to the other, then stopped outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for the knob to turn, but nothing happened. Just silence. In the morning, the hallway was empty, but there was a long, dark smear on the floorboards, as if something would have been dragged through the house. I convinced myself it was a dream, or maybe just Murphy leaving a mess, though I couldn't shake the image of those deliberate footsteps. The second night, I locked my door. I'd been hearing strange noises all day, faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, the distant sound of something scraping against metal. I told myself it was just the wind, just the old house settling. But when night fell, the noises grew louder. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, clutching the key like it could protect me. Around midnight, the footsteps returned, louder this time. They didn't stop outside my door. Instead, they circled the house, moving from window to window. I didn't dare look, but I knew something was out there, pacing, waiting. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to the sound of the door creaking open. The lock was still in place, but the door was ajar, the hallway beyond it swallowed in darkness. The key was no longer in my hand. It was standing upright in the center of the room, balancing impossibly on its jagged teeth. I ran. I didn't pack, didn't grab my phone or wallet. I just bolted out of the house, my heart hammering in my chest. Murphy was nowhere to be seen, the field stretching out around me like an ocean of shadows. As I reached my car, I turned back, just for a moment. The house was watching me. I can't explain it, but that's the only way to describe it. The windows glowed faintly, like hollow, hungry eyes, and the roof seemed to curl inward, as if the house was breathing. And then, just as I climbed into the driver's seat, I saw it. A figure, tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. It stood in the doorway, its silhouette perfectly still, its head tilted slightly as if listening. In its hand, it held the key. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I sped down the gravel driveway, not stopping until I was miles away. I haven't been back since, but sometimes, late at night, I hear those footsteps outside my apartment. Slow, deliberate circling. And when I wake in the morning, there's always a smear on the floor. Let's start a new story. I wasn't even planning to buy anything. I'd only stopped by the flea market to kill some time. It was one of those sprawling, chaotic setups where you can find anything from vintage jewelry to ancient VHS tapes. The painting wasn't even displayed prominently. It leaned against a pile of mismatched furniture, half covered by a stained quilt, as though someone had forgotten it there. Something about it caught my eye. It was simple, a forest scene, muted greens and browns, painted with a heavy hand. The trees were dark and gnarled, their branches reaching out like bony fingers. In the foreground, a dirt path wound into the woods, disappearing into a patch of shadow, so deep it looked like the canvas had been burned. But what struck me most was the figure. It was small, almost easy to miss, just a silhouette standing at the edge of the trees. The figure was facing away, its shape indistinct but unmistakably human. There was no face, no details, just a vague impression of a person. I couldn't explain why, but the painting unsettled me, and yet I couldn't stop looking at it. $20, the vendor said when he saw me staring. He was a wiry man with sun-leathered skin and eyes that darted around like they didn't want to settle anywhere for too long. "Do you know anything about it?" I asked, my voice sounding distant, even to me. He shrugged. "Found it in a storage unit. You want it or not?" I hesitated for a moment, then handed him the cash. When I brought it home, I wasn't sure where to put it. My apartment was small and cluttered, and the painting didn't really match anything I owned. Eventually, I hung it in the hallway just outside my bedroom. It felt right there, though I couldn't explain why. That night, I dreamed of the forest. I was standing on the dirt path, the gnarled trees rising around me like the bars of a cage. The air was heavy, suffused with the smell of damp earth and rot. I could hear something, a faint rustling in the underbrush, like something large moving just out of sight. Then I saw the figure. It was further down the path, standing exactly as it had in the painting. Its back was to me, its outline blurred and shifting, as though it wasn't quite solid. I tried to call out, but no sound came from my lips. The figure turned, just slightly, and though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze pierce through me. I woke up gasping, my sheets damp with sweat. The next morning I noticed something strange. The figure in the painting had moved. It wasn't at the edge of the trees anymore. It was further in, its silhouette smaller, swallowed by the shadows. For a long time, I stared at the canvas, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. But over the next few days, it kept happening. Every morning, the figure was deeper in the woods. It wasn't dramatic, just a few inches at a time, but it was unmistakable. The first time I pointed it out to a friend, they laughed nervously and told me I needed a break. The second time, they stopped answering my calls. The dreams continued too. Each night, I found myself in the forest, standing on that dirt path. The figure was always ahead of me, leading me deeper into the woods. The rustling grew louder, closer, but no matter how hard I tried to turn back, my feet kept moving forward. One night, the figure finally stopped. It stood at the edge of a clearing, its outline sharper now, almost painfully distinct. I couldn't make out a face, but I felt its attention, heavy and suffocating. It raised one hand, and I realized it was pointing. When I woke up, there was dirt on my shoes. I didn't leave my apartment for days after that. I covered the painting with an old sheet and tried to convince myself to throw it out. But every time I reached for it, my hands froze. I started hearing things at night. It began as faint whispers, just on the edge of hearing, too soft to make out the words. Then came the scratching. It sounded like nails against wood, dragging slowly, methodically, along the hallway outside my bedroom. The sheet over the painting didn't stay put. No matter how many times I tucked it in, I'd wake up to find it crumpled on the floor. Each time, the figure in the painting was closer to the center of the forest. And then one night it was gone. The painting was empty. The trees and the path remained, but the figure had vanished. I didn't sleep that night. At some point, the whispers stopped. So did the scratching. The silence was worse. It stretched on for hours, thick and oppressive, until I thought I'd go mad. Then came a knock. It was soft at first, barely audible like someone tapping on glass. But it grew louder, sharper, until it echoed through the apartment. I grabbed my phone and opened the door. There was nothing there. No one in the hallway. No signs of anyone outside. But when I turned back to my apartment, the painting was hanging in a different spot, directly across from my bed. The figure was back, but it wasn't in the forest anymore. It was standing in my room. The background of the painting had changed too. My bed, my desk, my clothes on the floor, they were all there, rendered in perfect detail. The figure stood at the foot of the bed, its shadow spilling out onto the floor, reaching toward me. I ran. I don't remember where I went or how long I stayed away, but when I finally returned, the painting was gone. The wall where it had hung was scorched, the faint outline of the frame burned into the plaster. But at night, I still hear the rustling. And sometimes, when I walk past a mirror, I see the forest, and I see the figure waiting, pointing for me to follow. Let's start a new story. Apartment. I wasn't looking for it. I'd moved in a few weeks earlier, and everything about the place screamed old and neglected. The walls were cracked, the pipes moaned when the water ran, and the floor sagged in the middle of the living room. I'd been planning to put a throw rug down to hide the worst of it, but when I stepped on one particular spot, it gave way with a hollow thunk. Curiosity got the better of me. I pried up the warped board with a screwdriver, expecting to find old insulation or maybe a stash of forgotten junk. What I didn't expect was the phone. It was an old rotary model, the kind you'd see in movies from the 1970s. Black, scuffed, and heavier than it looked. There was no cord, no dial tone, and no indication that it had been connected to anything in decades. I should have left it alone. Instead, I cleaned it up and set it on a side table. It was strange, sure, but I figured it might make for an interesting conversation piece when people visited. The first time it rang, I was asleep. The sound jolted me awake, loud and shrill, cutting through the quiet like a knife. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. The phone didn't have a cord. There was no way it could work. But the ringing continued, insistent and unnatural. It didn't sound like any phone I'd ever heard before. The tone was off, distorted like something imitating the sound of a phone without really understanding it. I stared at it from across the room, frozen. The ringing stopped after the 7th chime. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I told myself it had to be a malfunction. Maybe some old wiring had been triggered by moisture or temperature changes. It didn't make sense, but it was the only explanation I could come up with. That evening, as I was watching TV, it rang again. This time, I answered it. "Hello," I said, my voice shaky. At first, there was nothing but static, faint, and crackling. Then, after a long pause, a voice spoke. It was soft, distant, and wrong. "Is this you?" I blinked, gripping the receiver tighter. "Who is this?" Another long pause, punctuated by faint breathing. "You shouldn't have found this," the voice said. The line went dead. I put the phone back under the floorboards that night, shoving the board into place and stacking a box on top of it for good measure. Whatever it was, I wanted no part of it, but the phone didn't care. The next night, it was back on the side table, as if I'd never moved it. This time, it didn't ring. It just sat there, heavy and silent, its presence unnerving. I avoided looking at it, telling myself I was imagining things. But as the hours dragged on, I couldn't ignore the sense of weight in the air, like the phone was watching me. I tried to get rid of it. I took it to the dumpster behind the building, burying it under a pile of broken furniture and trash bags. I watched the garbage truck haul it away the next morning, relief washing over me as it disappeared down the street. That night it was back. It sat on the side table, pristine and untouched. The ringing started again, louder this time. I didn't answer. It rang for hours. By the 3rd night, I was unraveling. The ringing had become a part of my life, constant and inescapable. I tried everything, ignoring it, smashing it with a hammer, even taking it to the nearest river and throwing it in. But no matter what I did, it always returned. And then the messages started. At first, they were scrawled on the receiver in faint, jagged lines, like someone had scratched them in with a knife. "Answer. Talk to me. Don't ignore this." The words burned themselves into my mind, their presence as constant as the phone itself. The final straw came 2 weeks in. I woke up in the middle of the night to find the phone ringing beside my bed. I hadn't moved it there. This time, when I answered, the voice was clearer. "You should have left it alone," it said, low and menacing. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The line crackled, and the voice responded with a question of its own. "Do you remember where you were before this?" I froze. "What are you talking about?" A laugh, faint and distorted. "You're starting to remember, aren't you?" The line went dead, but the words stayed with me, digging into my thoughts like splinters. I didn't understand what the voice meant, at least not at first. But then the dreams started. They weren't dreams, exactly. They were more like flashes of something older. A place I didn't recognize, but felt familiar. A room filled with light that hurt to look at. Shadows moving against a horizon that didn't exist. And always, always the sound of that phone ringing in the distance. The memories, or whatever they were, grew stronger with each passing day. I started to feel disconnected from myself, like I was remembering 2 lives at once. My apartment felt wrong, the walls too close, the light too dim. I began to wonder if I'd ever really moved in at all. Last night, the phone didn't just ring. It spoke. This time, it didn't wait for me to pick up. The voice spilled out of the receiver, louder than ever, filling the room. "You don't belong here," it said. "You never did." I tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't break. The apartment itself seemed to shift, the walls pressing closer, the air turning stale. And then I heard the ringing again, not just from the phone, from everywhere. The sound is deafening now, vibrating through my bones, making it impossible to think. The room feels smaller, darker, the edges of the world closing in around me. I don't know where the phone came from, or what it wants, but I think I'm starting to remember, and I'm afraid it's not going to let me forget. Let's start a new story. I didn't notice it at first. I was rushing out the door for work, barely awake, pulling on my sneakers when I felt something crumpled under my foot. I groaned, thinking it was a receipt or a candy wrapper, something I'd accidentally stepped on the day before. But when I pulled the shoe off and tipped it upside down, a small piece of paper fluttered out. Don't look at it. The handwriting was jagged, almost frantic, the ink smeared in places like whoever had written it was in a hurry. I stared at the note, half expecting it to be a joke or some weird guerrilla marketing campaign. But there was no branding, no explanation. Just those 3 words. I should have laughed it off. Instead, I tucked the note into my pocket and spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the uneasy feeling it left behind. The next morning, there was another note. This time, it was taped to the bathroom mirror. It knows you saw it. I froze. The handwriting was the same. The paper looked identical. But I had no idea how it had gotten there. My apartment was locked, the windows shut tight. I lived alone. I tore the note down and threw it in the trash. By the 3rd day, I was sure someone was messing with me. Another note appeared, this time stuck to the inside of my fridge door. It's closer now. The words were scrawled so hard the pen had almost torn the paper. I spent the entire evening tearing apart my apartment, looking for signs of a break-in. I checked every lock, every window, every corner. Nothing. No sign of anyone else. But when I went to bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The whispers started the next day. I heard them first in the shower, just a faint murmur behind the rush of water. I thought it was the pipes, maybe a neighbor talking loudly through the walls. But as the day went on, the whispers followed me. In the kitchen as I poured coffee. In the living room while I scrolled my phone. In bed, just as I was drifting off. They weren't words, exactly. Just fragmented sounds, like someone speaking through a static-filled radio. But they were always there, just at the edge of hearing. That night, I dreamed of the notes. In the dream, they weren't pieces of paper anymore, but long, jagged scratches carved into the walls of my apartment. The words weren't warnings. They were commands, written over and over until the walls bled. When I woke up, my bedroom felt colder. There was a note on my nightstand. Don't turn around. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to look, but I couldn't. The room was silent. No whispers, no creaks. Just my own breathing, shallow and frantic. After what felt like hours, I bolted from the bed and ran out of the apartment. I spent the night in my car, parked in a gas station lot, my fingers gripping the steering wheel so tight they ached. The whispers didn't follow me that night. But the next morning, when I returned to my apartment, I found the walls covered in writing. It was the same handwriting as the notes, looping and jagged, the ink smeared in frantic strokes. It wasn't just on the walls either. It was on the ceilings, the windows, the furniture, even the inside of my closet. You shouldn't have seen it. It's here. It won't stop. I grabbed my keys and ran. I stayed with a friend for a few days after that, refusing to go back to my apartment. I told her I'd had a break-in, but when she asked if anything was stolen, I didn't know how to answer. What would I say? No, nothing was stolen, but someone or something covered my apartment in deranged graffiti. She let me crash on her couch, but even there, I couldn't escape it. The notes started showing up again, tucked into my bags, hidden under my pillow. The whispers returned, too louder now, almost angry. And then I saw it. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. My eyes flicked toward the corner of the room, and that's when I saw the shadow. It wasn't shaped like a person. It was long, spindly, with limbs that seemed to stretch and twist in impossible ways. It didn't move, not at first. It just stood there, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, staring at me. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. And then slowly it pointed, not at me, at the wall behind me. I turned my head, trembling, and saw the note taped above the bed. It's too late. When I looked back, the shadow was gone. I don't know what it wants. I don't know what I saw, or why it's following me. But I can feel it getting closer. The notes come every day now, no matter where I go. They're in my car, my bag, even my food. Each one is more frantic, more desperate. You can't escape. You should have looked away. It's almost here. And the whispers, they're no longer whispers. They're screams. Last night, I found a note on my bathroom mirror. The handwriting was different this time, shaky and uneven. It said, "Run, but I don't know where to go." Let's start a new story. Victorian at the edge of the neighborhood, its gables leaning like a drunk who couldn't quite stay upright. The yard was a wasteland of dead grass and rusted junk, and the paint had peeled so completely that the wood underneath looked like dry skin. Kids whispered about it being haunted. We dared each other to get close, but no one ever did. Even the most reckless among us stayed away from the cracked steps and broken windows. Then one day, the lights were on. It was subtle at first, a soft glow spilling from the windows, so faint you'd think it was a trick of the setting sun. I only noticed because I walked past it every evening on my way home from work. The second night, the glow was stronger, warmer, and I swear I saw someone moving behind the curtain, a brief flicker of a shadow, like a figure walking by. By the third night, I was sure the house wasn't empty anymore. I told my neighbor, Mr. Grant, who'd lived on the block for 50 years. "Someone's moved in," I said. He gave me a strange look. "That house? Yeah, I've seen the lights. I think I saw someone inside." Mr. Grant frowned, his wrinkled face tightening in a way that made me feel uneasy. "No one's lived there since the Thompsons," he said. "And that was, 40 years ago? House has been falling apart ever since." "Well, someone's living there now," I insisted. "Maybe you're seeing things," he muttered, but he wouldn't look at me when he said it. That night, I decided to take a closer look. The walk was short, barely 5 minutes, but it felt longer. The closer I got, the heavier the air seemed to grow, thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew. When I reached the house, the lights were on again, spilling from every window, far brighter than they had been before. Warm, golden light that looked wrong. It didn't flicker or shift the way normal light does. It was steady, unyielding, as though the house itself were glowing from within. The yard was quieter than it should have been. No crickets, no rustling leaves. Just silence. I stepped onto the sidewalk, craning my neck to get a better look. And that's when I saw her. A woman was standing in the upstairs window, her face pale and ghostly in the light. Her features were soft, almost too perfect, like a porcelain doll brought to life. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring out at the street. At me. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. But when I blinked, she was gone. The next morning, I woke up to find an envelope on my front porch. It was unmarked, the paper yellowed and brittle. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 words written in neat, looping handwriting. "You should come inside." My stomach twisted. I looked up and down the street, but it was empty. I tried to tell myself it was a prank. Someone messing with me, maybe one of the neighborhood kids. But the handwriting, it wasn't childish. It was elegant, old-fashioned, like something from another era. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the note. About the woman in the window. About the lights that never flickered. And so, against my better judgment, I went back. The house looked the same as it had the night before, its windows glowing like embers in the dark. The front door was slightly ajar, a sliver of golden light spilling onto the porch. I should have turned back. Instead, I stepped inside. The air was warm, too warm. It smelled faintly of flowers, roses maybe, but there was something sour beneath it, something sharp and chemical. The house looked nothing like I'd expected. The walls were pristine, the floors polished to a mirror shine. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals sparkling in the light. Furniture, elegant and antique, was arranged with care, as though a family had just stepped out for the evening. But it was silent, too silent. I moved through the rooms, my footsteps muffled by thick carpets. Each room was immaculate, perfectly preserved, but there was something wrong with the details. A clock on the mantel ticked backward. A portrait on the wall showed a family with faces too blurred to recognize. A vase of roses sat on a side table, but the flowers were black, their petals glistening as though wet. And then I heard the humming. It was faint at first, a low, lilting tune that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I followed it, my heart pounding, until I reached the staircase. She was there at the top of the stairs. The woman from the window. She looked the same, porcelain skin, doll-like features, but up close her eyes were wrong. Too large, too dark, the pupils swallowing the whites. "You came," she said, her voice soft, melodic. I couldn't speak. "Come upstairs," she said, tilting her head. "We've been waiting for you." I stepped back. Her smile widened, and for the first time, I saw her teeth. They were sharp, too sharp, like rows of tiny needles. The humming grew louder. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the polished floor as I stumbled toward the door. The house seemed to shift around me, the walls bending, the light dimming, the air growing thick and heavy. When I finally reached the door, I burst outside, gasping for air. The house was dark again, silent. The next morning, the lights were back on. I don't walk that route anymore. I don't tell anyone what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I see it from my window, the soft, golden glow spilling out onto the street, and the faint shadow of someone standing in the upstairs window, watching. Let's start a new story. I wasn't expecting anything. I don't shop online often, and my birthday was months away. So when I stepped outside and saw the box sitting there, plain, unmarked with no postage or return address, I was instantly uneasy. It wasn't large, about the size of a shoebox, and taped shut so meticulously that even the seams were sealed. I stood there, staring at it for a long time, trying to decide whether to touch it. Curiosity won out. I brought it inside, setting it on my kitchen table like it might detonate if I handled it wrong. After a minute of staring at it, I grabbed a pair of scissors and carefully cut the tape. Inside, nestled in a bed of crumpled newspaper, was a single object, an old-fashioned pocket watch. It was heavy, its silver surface tarnished and scratched with intricate, swirling designs carved into the casing. When I opened it, the face was cracked, the hands frozen at 3:15. There was no note, no explanation, just the watch, ticking faintly despite its broken appearance. I should have thrown it away. Something about it felt wrong from the start, like it didn't belong to me, like it didn't belong anywhere. But instead, I left it on the table, convincing myself it was some kind of prank. Maybe a neighbor had misplaced it. Maybe someone thought it was funny. That night, I woke up at exactly 3:15 a.m. At first, I didn't know what had woken me. The room was dark, the silence broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. I lay there, blinking at the ceiling, when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tick-tick-tick. The watch. I hadn't noticed it ticking before, not like this. The sound was faint but relentless, a precise metronome that somehow filled the room. My heart started to race. I got up, padded to the kitchen, and found it exactly where I'd left it. Its hand still hadn't moved, stuck at 3:15, but the ticking was louder now, as if amplified by the darkness. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I threw the watch away. I put it in a plastic bag, tied it shut, and tossed it into the dumpster behind my apartment. As I walked back inside, I felt a flicker of relief, like I'd closed a chapter on something I couldn't quite name. That feeling lasted until I came home from work. Sitting on my kitchen table, exactly where it had been the day before, was the watch. I froze in the doorway, my keys dangling from my hand. The kitchen window was closed, the door locked, and yet here it was. The ticking was softer now, almost gentle, but the sound made my skin crawl. I wanted to throw it away again, to drive it far out of town and dump it somewhere no one could find it, but something stopped me. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like expectation, like the watch wanted me to do something. That night, it ticked louder than ever, and again, I woke up at 3:15. This time, there was something new. The smell of smoke. It wasn't strong, just a faint, acrid scent like burnt wood. I checked every corner of my apartment, my heart pounding, but there was no fire, no source of the smell. When I came back to the kitchen, the watch was open, the cracked glass face gleaming in the moonlight. I hadn't opened it. I called the police the next morning. I didn't tell them about the watch. What would I even say? Instead, I told them I thought someone had broken into my apartment, that I felt unsafe. They sent an officer to look around, but there was no sign of forced entry, no evidence anyone had been there except me. I asked if they could patrol the area, and they promised they would, but their words felt hollow. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch with every light in the apartment blazing, the watch ticking away on the table. I considered throwing it away again, smashing it with a hammer, anything to get rid of it. But the thought made my chest tighten, like I'd regret it forever. At 3:15, the smell of smoke returned, thicker this time. I grabbed the watch and stepped outside, needing fresh air. But when I opened the door, I froze. The hallway was filled with ash. It wasn't thick enough to obscure the floor, but it was there, dusting the walls and the carpet in a fine, gray layer. My neighbors' doors were closed, silent, as if the world beyond my apartment didn't exist anymore. I stepped back inside and slammed the door, my hands shaking. I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I stayed home from work, determined to figure out what was happening. I searched the watch for anything, hidden compartments, engravings, markings that might explain its purpose. But there was nothing. Just the same cracked face, the same ticking hands. Around noon, I turned the watch over and saw something I hadn't noticed before, a tiny clasp on the back, almost invisible against the tarnished silver. I pried it open, revealing a compartment filled with something that made my stomach drop. Hair, strands of dark hair, tied together with a thin red thread. I dropped the watch and backed away, my pulse thundering in my ears. I had no idea what I was holding, but it wasn't normal. It wasn't safe. That night, the ticking stopped. I should have been relieved, but the silence was worse. It was heavy, oppressive, pressing down on me like a physical weight. At 3:15, the smoke returned, so thick I could barely breathe. I stumbled to the door, trying to escape, but when I opened it, I wasn't in the hallway anymore. I was in a burned-out room, the walls blackened with soot, the air choking with ash. A single chair sat in the center of the room, and on it was a man. His face was turned away, but I could see the charred remains of his hands, the twisted metal of a watch clutched in his fingers. My watch. He turned toward me, his face hollow and burned, and smiled. The last thing I heard before I blacked out was the ticking, louder than ever, counting down to something I didn't want to know. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. The watch was gone, the air clear, but the faint smell of smoke lingered. I haven't left the apartment since. The ticking stopped that night, but now it's back. Let's start a new story. The delivery wasn't mine. It arrived on a Thursday, one of those gray afternoons where the air sits heavy with the threat of rain. I found it outside my apartment door, a sleek black box with no shipping label, no name, just a perfect cube tied with a single silver ribbon. At first, I thought it was for my neighbor, Mr. DeWitt. He orders so much online that the hallway often looks like a warehouse. But there was no name, no address, nothing. I brought it inside, meaning to ask the neighbors later. That's when the whispering started. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves in the distance. I brushed it off as the wind or my old apartment pipes grumbling. But the closer I got to the box, the louder it became. A soft, insistent hum that tickled at the edges of comprehension. It wasn't a language I knew, but there was rhythm to it, like the cadence of a prayer spoken in reverse. I should have left it alone. Instead, I untied the ribbon. The box lid lifted easily, as if it had been waiting. Inside was something wrapped in tissue paper, heavy and cold to the touch. I pulled it out, unwrapping the layers carefully, and found a clock. But not a normal clock. It was small, about the size of a paperback, made of polished wood so dark it was almost black. The face had no numbers, only 3 slender, golden hands that twitched erratically, not following any logical time. Where the numbers should have been, there were tiny symbols etched in silver, spirals, crosses, jagged lines that didn't look human. As I held it, the whispering grew louder, clearer, as if the clock itself were speaking to me. I should have put it back. I should have called someone, done anything but what I did next. I wound it. The hands froze for a moment, then spun wildly, faster than I thought possible. My apartment flickered, the lights dimmed, the air grew colder, and a faint metallic tang filled my mouth. The hands stopped abruptly at a single point, all 3 of them aligned to one of the strange symbols on the face. The whispering stopped, and then the knock came. It wasn't from the door. It was from the window. I live on the 6th floor. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the window. Rain streaked the glass, and beyond it was nothing but the dull gray of the afternoon sky. But the knock came again, louder this time, sharper. I edged closer, my heart pounding, and peered out. At first I saw nothing, just the city skyline blurred by rain. But as I leaned in, I noticed the faint outline of something pressed against the glass. Pale, spindly fingers, too long and too thin to be human. They dragged slowly down the pane, leaving streaks that didn't match the pattern of the rain. The clock ticked. I stumbled back, clutching it in my hands as though it could protect me. The knocking stopped, but the air in the room felt different, denser, charged. I didn't want to look back at the window. I didn't want to know what might be there. But then I heard it. Not a knock this time. A voice. Let me in. It wasn't loud, but it filled the room, vibrating in my chest like the low rumble of a distant storm. The words were slow, deliberate, each syllable stretching too long. I didn't answer. The voice came again, closer now. You opened it. You started the time. I don't remember running, but I must have. One moment I was standing in the living room, clutching the clock, and the next I was on the floor of my bathroom, the door locked behind me. The clock sat on the tile next to me, still and silent, its hands frozen at that strange symbol. I stayed there for hours, too afraid to move, listening to the faint scrape of something against the walls outside. It wasn't until the first rays of morning light slipped under the bathroom door that the sound stopped. When I finally opened the door, the apartment was empty. The window was intact, no streaks or fingerprints on the glass. The air was warm again, the metallic tang gone. It was as if nothing had happened, except for the clock. It sat on the coffee table where I'd left it, its hands ticking again, slowly now, moving counterclockwise. The whispering had started again, quieter this time, but no less insistent. I tried to get rid of it. I threw it in the trash, left it in a dumpster down the block, even took a train across the city and left it on a bench at the station. But every time, without fail, I'd come home to find it waiting for me, perfectly centered on the coffee table, the hands always pointing at that same impossible symbol. I don't know what it's counting down to, but I'm starting to hear the knocking again. And this time, it's not at the window. It's at the door. Let's start a new story. Ended in a metal box, dangling over a shaft that could plummet at any second, just didn't sit right with me. But when I moved into the Sinclair building in 1920s Art Deco monolith downtown, my options were limited. My new apartment was on the 14th floor, and there was no way I was taking the stairs every day. The elevator was ancient, the kind with ornate brass gates and a lever you had to pull to close the doors. It creaked and groaned with every floor, and the flickering bulb overhead made it feel less like modern transportation and more like stepping into a time capsule. The first time I rode it, the attendant, a wiry old man with sunken cheeks and a faded uniform, gave me a tight-lipped smile and said, "You'll get used to it." He didn't say anything else, just pulled the lever and stared straight ahead as the floor numbers ticked by. It wasn't the kind of elevator you could operate yourself. The building insisted on attendance, claiming it was part of the building's historic charm. I didn't argue. The man seemed harmless, and he was always there, morning and night, no matter the hour. I figured he lived in the building, or maybe he had a second job here. Either way, he became part of the background, just another quirk of the Sinclair. The first time I noticed something odd was about 2 weeks after I moved in. I'd just gotten home late from work, exhausted and carrying a bag of groceries. The attendant was waiting, as always, his expression blank as he nodded for me to step inside. He pulled the lever, and the elevator began its slow, rattling ascent. We passed the 7th floor when the lights flickered and went out. The elevator shuddered to a stop, plunging us into darkness. My stomach lurched. Is this normal?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The attendant didn't answer. "Hello," I said louder this time. My voice echoed in the small space. Still, no response. My pulse quickened as I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam caught the brass walls, the peeling ceiling, and the edge of the attendant's cap. But his face was gone. He wasn't there. I stared at the spot where he should have been, the dim light from my phone illuminating nothing but an empty uniform standing upright in the corner. The cap rested on top, as if an invisible head were wearing it, but there was no head, no hands, nothing. The elevator jerked back to life. The lights flickered on, and the attendant was there again, just as he'd always been, staring straight ahead. My heart was racing, my palms clammy. "What just happened?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He just reached for the lever, and the elevator continued its climb. When we reached the 14th floor, I practically ran out. The attendant didn't look at me or say goodbye. The doors closed behind me, and I stood there in the hallway, trying to catch my breath. I convinced myself it had been a trick of the light, maybe exhaustion. Stress could do strange things to your mind, right? But it wasn't the last time. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. The elevator would stop on floors where no one got on or off. Sometimes, when the doors opened, the hallways beyond were dark, empty, and unfamiliar, as if the building had rearranged itself. Once, it opened onto what looked like a long, unfinished corridor, concrete walls, exposed pipes, no lighting. I stared in confusion until the attendant pulled the lever again, and the doors slid shut without explanation. I stopped riding the elevator whenever I could avoid it, taking the stairs even when it meant an extra 10 minutes to get to my floor. But sometimes late at night, when I was too tired or carrying too much, I had no choice. One night, I worked late and came home just past midnight. The lobby was eerily quiet, and the elevator doors were already open, waiting for me. The attendant stood inside, his hands folded neatly over the lever. He didn't smile or nod this time. He just watched me as I stepped in, his gaze unsettlingly intense. 14th floor, I said, my voice trembling. He didn't move. The elevator doors slid shut, and we stood there, unmoving. "Are we going up or not?" I asked, trying to sound annoyed instead of terrified. Still, he didn't respond. The silence stretched, oppressive and suffocating. And then, slowly, he turned his head to face me. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. His mouth opened, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was mine. "You shouldn't have come here," it said in my exact tone, my inflections, my cadence. "It doesn't want you here." I stumbled back, pressing myself against the brass gate. "What are you talking about?" I managed to choke out. The elevator began to move. But instead of ascending, it plunged downward, faster than it had ever moved before. The walls rattled violently, the flickering bulb overhead swinging wildly. I screamed, clutching the gate, as the numbers on the panel above the door blurred, racing past the basement floor into negative numbers. -1, -2, -3. The air grew colder, heavier, filled with a low hum that vibrated in my teeth. The attendant didn't move. His head was still turned toward me, his empty eyes wide and unblinking, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. The elevator stopped with a jarring lurch, throwing me to the floor. The doors slid open. It wasn't the basement. It wasn't even the building. Beyond the doors was a void, endless and black, filled with distant, shifting lights like dying stars. And in the darkness, shapes moved. They were massive and slow, their forms impossible to define, their edges flickering like they weren't fully real. They weren't human. They weren't anything I could name. The hum grew louder, more insistent, pressing into my skull like claws. The attendant stepped forward, his movements stiff and mechanical, and I realized he wasn't walking toward the void. He was stepping into it. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing for the lever. The metal was ice cold, searing my palm, but I yanked it with all my strength. The doors slammed shut, the elevator jerking upward with a speed that made my stomach lurch. The hum faded, replaced by the familiar groans of the ancient machinery. When the elevator stopped, I was on the 14th floor. The doors opened onto the hallway, quiet and untouched, as if nothing had happened. The attendant was gone. I took the stairs every day after that. It didn't matter how late I worked or how heavy my bags were. I never set foot in the elevator again. I told myself I'd move, but every time I tried to pack, something stopped me. The air in my apartment felt heavier. My dreams filled with that endless void and its shifting shapes. Last night, I heard the sound of the elevator outside my door. It wasn't stopping on my floor. It wasn't moving between floors. It was just there, rattling and groaning, as if waiting for me. This morning, there was a note slipped under my door, written in trembling, unfamiliar handwriting. You can't escape it. The Sinclair always collects. Let's start a new story. Fancy, cracked tiles in the bathroom, creaky floors, but it was mine and I liked it. I knew every inch of the place, from the weird smudge on the ceiling above the couch to the closet door that never stayed shut. Or at least I thought I did. Last Tuesday, I came home late from work, exhausted and starving. I kicked off my shoes and headed for the kitchen, flipping on the lights as I went. That's when I noticed it, a door at the end of the hallway. A door that had never been there before. It was plain, unremarkable. White paint, brass handle, no different from the other doors in the apartment. Except it wasn't supposed to be there. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, my brain doing somersaults. Maybe I just never noticed it before? Maybe the landlord had come by and added it for some reason? Neither explanation made sense, but I was too tired to care. I ignored the door and went to bed. The next morning, it was locked. I didn't think much of it at first. Curiosity tugged at me, sure, but I had a meeting to get to and bills to pay. I didn't have time to obsess over some mystery door. But as the week went on, the door started to bother me. Every time I walked past it, I felt it watching me. Not in a literal sense. There was no peephole or hidden camera, but in the way you can feel someone staring at you in a crowded room. I tried the handle a few times. It wouldn't budge. Thursday night, I decided to confront it. I grabbed a flashlight, a butter knife. It felt silly, but I wanted something in case this turned into a horror movie, and a determination to figure out what was going on. I crouched in front of the door and peered at the edges. No ups, no hinges on this side, just a solid frame flush with the wall. I knocked on it 3 sharp raps. The sound echoed, faint but hollow, like knocking on an empty box. I waited, flashlight shaking in my hand. Nothing happened. Then I pressed my ear to the door. At first, I heard only silence. Then, just as I was about to pull away, there was a sound. A soft, rhythmic scratching like nails on wood. I scrambled back, heart pounding, and stared at the door. My breathing was loud in the quiet apartment, and I half expected the handle to turn, for something to come bursting through. But it didn't. That night, I dreamed of the door. In the dream, it was open. On the other side was darkness. Not the empty kind, but the alive kind, pulsing and shifting like a living thing. Something was moving inside it too, though I couldn't see what. I only felt it, watching, waiting. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of scratching still echoing in my ears. The door was unlocked. I stood in the hallway, staring at the handle. It was turned slightly like someone had opened it just a crack. My hand shook as I reached for it. Slowly, I pulled the door open. There was no darkness. No pulsing void, just a staircase. The stairs spiraled downward, disappearing into shadows far below. A faint light flickered at the bottom, too dim to make out its source. I don't know why I went down. I told myself it was curiosity, the same impulse that makes you lean over a railing just to see how far the drop is. But as my foot touched the first step, I felt something else, a pull, deep and magnetic, like the staircase wanted me to descend. The walls were smooth, the air cold and still. My footsteps echoed as I went, the flickering light growing brighter with each turn. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a room. It was small, circular, and empty except for a single chair in the center. The chair was old, wooden, its surface worn smooth from years of use. On it sat a box. The box was plain, about the size of a shoebox, and tied shut with a length of red string. It was the only thing in the room, and yet it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there or anywhere. I wanted to leave. Every part of me screamed to turn around and climb back up those stairs. But I didn't. Instead, I reached out and untied the string. The box opened silently, the lid sliding off like it had been waiting for me. Inside was a photograph. It was old, black and white, the edges frayed. The image showed a group of people standing in front of a house, their faces blurred and indistinct. At the center of the group was me, not someone who looked like me. Me. Same face, same build, same tired expression. I dropped the photo, the box clattering to the floor, and stumbled back. The room seemed to shift around me, the walls pressing closer, the air thickening. The staircase was gone. I turned in frantic circles, searching for an exit, but the room had no doors, no windows, no way out. The chair creaked behind me. I spun around. The box was empty, the photograph gone. In its place was a mirror. And in the mirror, my reflection didn't move. It stared at me, its face calm, its eyes too bright. Slowly it smiled, and then it spoke. "It's your turn now." The lights flickered, and the room went dark. When I woke up, I was sitting in the chair, the box in my lap. The staircase was back, winding upward into the light. I climbed it, each step heavier than the last, my hands trembling as I pushed the door open. I was in my apartment again, but the door was gone. The hallway was empty, the wall smooth and unbroken, as if the door had never existed. The box is still on my table. The red string is tied neatly around it, and I can hear scratching from inside. Let's start a new story. The day it all began, I found a single sock in the laundry that wasn't mine or hers. It was navy blue, cheap cotton, and stretched out at the ankle, the kind you'd find in a bargain bin at a big box store. It wasn't the kind of sock Maya would wear, and it wasn't mine either. We lived alone. No roommates, no overnight guests, just us. And yet, there it was, tangled among the whites like a stowaway. I held it up to her when she walked into the kitchen, coffee mug in hand. "This yours?" Maya glanced at it, her face blank for a split second before she laughed. "No, of course not. Must have gotten mixed up at the laundromat." She shrugged and took a sip of her coffee, like that was the most natural thing in the world. "We didn't use the laundromat. The sock disappeared after that. She must have thrown it out when I wasn't looking. I didn't ask her about it again. It seemed too small, too stupid to start a fight over. But it stuck in my head like a splinter. Then came the receipts. Not in her bag, not on the kitchen counter, but in her car. I was looking for an umbrella in the glove box when I found them, folded neatly and tucked into a corner. They were for small things, a sandwich shop across town, a bookstore I'd never heard her mention. And the times on them didn't make sense. 11:15 a.m., 2:30 p.m. Hours she was supposed to be at work. I confronted her about one of them, a receipt from the bookstore. "Oh yes," she said, not missing a beat. "I stopped in on my lunch break. They had this cool poetry collection. Want to see it?" She showed me a book that night, an anthology of old poems. But the pages were pristine, the spine uncreased, like she hadn't even cracked it open. It wasn't just the receipts. It was the little things, piling up like snow on a roof ready to cave in. The way she'd suddenly started wearing perfume again, a subtle floral scent I didn't recognize. The way she'd linger in the shower after coming home late, the bathroom door locked when it had never been before. The way her phone, once left casually on the counter, was now always face down, always in her pocket or her hand. One Saturday, when she said she was meeting an old friend for coffee, I decided to follow her. I knew how it sounded, paranoid, obsessive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening right in front of me, just out of sight. She didn't go to the cafe. She went to a small art gallery downtown, a place I didn't even know existed. I parked a block away and watched as she stepped inside, her coat pulled tight against the wind. 10 minutes later, a man walked in, tall, with sandy blonde hair and a confident, easy gait. He greeted her with a hug that lingered just a second too long. I stayed in the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. I told myself there could be an innocent explanation. Maybe he was the friend she'd mentioned. Maybe they were catching up, reminiscing about old times. But deep down, I already knew. She came home that evening with a painting, a small abstract piece, swirling blues and golds. "Look what I found," she said, her voice bright, her smile wide. "Thought it would look great in the hallway." "Where'd you get it?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Oh, just a little gallery I stumbled upon," she said, hanging it on the wall with care. She didn't mention the man. She didn't mention the hug. For weeks, I pretended everything was fine. I laughed at her jokes, held her hand during movies, kissed her goodnight. But I started noticing more. The way she'd hum quietly to herself when she thought I wasn't listening, a tune I didn't recognize. The way her texts had grown shorter, her replies delayed. The way she started slipping out for errands more often, always returning with something small: groceries, a scarf, a book, little trophies from her time away. And then, one night, I woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She was asleep, her face peaceful in the dim light. The screen lit up with a name I didn't know: Elliot. The message preview read, "Can't stop thinking about today. When can I see you again?" My chest tightened. I stared at the screen until it went dark, my mind racing. I didn't wake her. I didn't grab her phone and demand answers. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my ears. The next morning, I made coffee like I always did. She walked into the kitchen, sleepy and smiling, and kissed me on the cheek. "You're up early," she said. "Yeah," I said, handing her a mug. Couldn't sleep. She didn't notice the way my hand trembled as I poured the coffee. She didn't notice the way I avoided her eyes. That evening, I told her I needed to go for a drive. She offered to come with me, but I told her I needed some time alone. She didn't press me. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring into streaks. I ended up at the beach, sitting in the cold sand as the waves crashed in the distance. I thought about the sock, the receipts, the painting, the message, all the little things that had led to this moment. When I finally came home, she was waiting for me, her face pale, her hands clenched in her lap. "Is everything okay?" she asked. I looked at her, the woman I'd shared so many years with, and felt the weight of the truth pressing down on me. "No," I said quietly. "It's not." I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, as if she'd been waiting for this moment all along. Let's start a new story. It was late, and I was working from home, half asleep at my desk with the glow of my laptop the only light in the room. My office window overlooked a dark alley, and the ambient light from the street lamp outside barely made it through the blinds. I'd gotten up to grab a glass of water, rubbing the exhaustion from my eyes, when I saw it. My shadow wasn't where it should have been. The faint glow from the screen cast a clear silhouette of my desk chair against the wall, but no silhouette of me. I waved my arm, thinking it was just some weird trick of the light. Nothing. The desk chair stayed perfectly still, its shadow untouched by my movement. I turned on the ceiling light. That's when the shadow appeared. It didn't match me. It was faint, warped, like it didn't belong to me. The head was tilted slightly to the side, the shoulders too broad. I stood perfectly still, watching it, waiting for it to mimic me, but it didn't. The shadow stayed where it was, its head tilted in that unnatural way, like it was listening for something I couldn't hear. I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me, trying to convince myself that I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the image of that crooked, listening head. The next day, I avoided the office entirely. I worked from the kitchen table instead, keeping the blinds open and the lights on. Nothing unusual happened, and I started to feel a little silly for being so freaked out. Shadows are just shadows, right? But that night, when I finally worked up the courage to go back to the office, the shadow was waiting for me. It was darker this time, more defined. It stood in the corner of the room, far from the desk, its head still tilted at that unnatural angle. My stomach turned as I realized it wasn't faint like before. It was solid, sharper than the shadows cast by the objects in the room. I slowly backed away, my hand fumbling for the light switch. The shadow didn't move, didn't flinch, but as soon as the room went dark, I swear I heard something, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against itself. That night I didn't sleep. The third night, I woke up to find it standing at the foot of my bed. I hadn't heard it enter, hadn't felt its presence until I opened my eyes and saw the outline of that tilted head, now much closer. It wasn't on the wall this time. It was upright, hovering over me, its edges sharp against the faint moonlight slipping through the curtains. I couldn't move. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadow shifted, its head straightening for the first time. The movement was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. And then for the first time it spoke. "I've been waiting." The voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room, resonating deep in my chest. It wasn't a human voice. It sounded like the groan of wood under pressure, the hiss of wind slipping through cracks. For what? I managed to choke out. For you to notice. The lights flickered on, breaking the moment. My heart pounded as I looked around, but the shadow was gone. My room was empty. I didn't go back to sleep. By the time the sun rose, I convinced myself that it was stress, sleep deprivation, some combination of the two. I spent the day with friends, avoiding my apartment entirely. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. What could I say? That my shadow had a voice? That it wasn't mine? That night I decided to test it. I sat in my living room with every light turned off, waiting. Hours passed and nothing happened. I almost laughed at myself for how paranoid I'd been. But then, just as I was about to give up and go to bed, the room grew colder. I turned my head slowly, and there it was. Not just one shadow this time. They were everywhere. On the walls, the ceiling, even the floor, unnatural silhouettes that didn't match the objects in the room. Some were faint, some sharp, but all of them were wrong. And they were moving. They crawled across the walls like insects, their shapes shifting and twisting. Some had arms too long, legs bent the wrong way. Others were smaller, scuttling in the corners like rodents. And then I saw it, the original shadow, the one that had been waiting. It was in the center of the room now, no longer faint, no longer hesitant. It was tall, its head straightened, its form more defined than ever. It stepped forward, not on the floor, but through it, as if the shadows themselves had become solid beneath its feet. "You're ready," it said. "For what?" I asked, barely able to breathe. It smiled. I didn't know shadows could smile, but it did. Its edges rippled. And then it spoke again, its voice a deep vibration that filled the air. To become one of us. Before I could respond, the lights went out. The room was pitch black, and for a moment there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just silence so complete it felt like it had weight. Then the shadows surged forward, and I felt them wrap around me, cold and suffocating, pulling me into the darkness. When I woke up, it was morning. The apartment looked normal, but I wasn't. The first time I noticed, it was in the mirror. My reflection was off just slightly. My head tilted at the wrong angle, my movements lagging by a fraction of a second. And when I stepped into the sunlight, I cast no shadow. I don't know what I am now, but I know they're still watching. Every night, I hear their whispers in the corners of the room, soft and constant, like a lullaby. They're waiting for me to join them, completely. Let's start a new story. I was clearing out my grandmother's house after her passing, a tedious but necessary chore. The house was old, a creaky Victorian perched on the edge of a sleepy town. It was the kind of place where time felt like it had stopped sometime in the 1950s. Every room filled with lace curtains, porcelain figurines, and stacks of faded family photographs. I'd always loved the photos when I was a kid. They told stories of lives before mine, faces I'd only heard about in hushed, nostalgic tones. My grandmother had been the family archivist, meticulously labeling each picture with names, dates, and places in her spidery handwriting. But as I sifted through the albums, something struck me as odd. In every photo, there was a man I didn't recognize. At first, I thought I'd simply forgotten about him. Maybe he was an uncle or a distant relative I'd never met. He was in dozens of photos, sometimes standing off to the side, sometimes blending into the crowd. But as I studied them more closely, unease crept in. In one photo from 1954, taken at a family picnic, the man stood near the edge of the group, his face partially obscured by shadow. In another, dated 1967, he leaned against a lamppost at a cousin's wedding, his expression unreadable. He always looked the same, dark hair neatly combed, wearing a plain suit, his posture unnervingly stiff. It wasn't just that he looked identical in every photo. It was his eyes. They never looked at the camera. In every single picture, his gaze was fixed on something or someone just outside the frame. I showed the photos to my mom later that evening. "That's weird," she said, squinting at the images. "I don't recognize him. Maybe a neighbor? A family friend?" But when I asked about the dates, how he could look exactly the same across decades, her brow furrowed. Maybe it's a different guy? I don't know. I've never seen him before. Her answer didn't help. I went back to the house the next day, determined to figure out who this man was. I combed through the albums, looking for any clue, anything that might connect him to our family. There were no labels mentioning him, no notes in the margins. He was just there. And then I found the one that made my stomach drop. It was a photo of me. I was 8 years old, sitting on the front porch of my grandmother's house, holding a popsicle and grinning at the camera. I remembered the moment vividly. My mom had taken the photo on one of our summer visits. But in the background, just barely visible at the edge of the frame, was the man. He was standing on the sidewalk, half hidden by a tree, his head turned slightly toward me. I slammed the album shut and shoved it aside, my hands trembling. He couldn't have been there. I grabbed my phone and called my mom again, my voice shaking. "Do you still have that picture of me on the porch? The one with the popsicle?" "Of course," she said. "It's in one of the albums at home." "Why? Can you check? Right now?" There was a pause as she went to find it. I paced the room, my heart pounding, until she came back on the line. "It's just you on the porch," she said. "Why?" I hung up without answering. The photo in her album was different. I didn't go back to the house the next day. I couldn't bring myself to, not after what I'd seen. But the unease followed me home. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, made my skin crawl. The photos wouldn't leave my mind. The way he always stood just at the edge of the frame, always looking at something unseen. The way he never changed. And then one night I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, like footsteps in another room. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, my heart thundering in my chest. The sound grew louder, closer. Slow, deliberate steps coming down the hall. I grabbed my phone, its weak light the only weapon I had, and crept toward the door. My apartment was small, just a one-bedroom, so there wasn't much space to search. The footsteps stopped. I stood there, trembling, listening to the silence. And then I saw it, a shadow, just at the edge of the hallway, flickering faintly in the dim glow of my phone. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadow shifted, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a face. Dark hair, a plain suit, the man from the photos. I don't remember much after that. I must have fainted or blacked out, because when I woke up, it was morning and the apartment was empty. But the unease hasn't left. I try to forget about the photos, about the man, but it's impossible. Yesterday, I was walking home from the store when I caught a glimpse of something in a shop window. A man in a plain suit, standing across the street, staring at me. When I turned to look, he was gone. And then this morning I found a photo in my mailbox. It's of me, taken from outside my apartment window. And in the background, standing just behind the glass, is the man. Let's start a new story. I found it wedged inside a secondhand book I'd picked up at a charity shop. The book was forgettable, a tattered mystery novel with a water-stained cover. But the map wasn't. It was drawn by hand, its edges burned slightly, as though it had been rescued from a fire. The ink was dark and precise, forming a detailed layout of what appeared to be a neighborhood. At the bottom corner, written in a sharp, slanted script, was a single instruction. Find what's missing. I stared at the map for a long time. The streets were unfamiliar, the landmarks vague. A clock tower, a fountain, something labeled the watching tree. But something about the map unsettled me. The way the lines seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking. The way the paper felt too warm, as though it had been held tightly in someone's hands just moments before. I wasn't sure why I didn't just throw it away. Instead, I folded it carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. That night, I dreamed of the map. In the dream, I was standing in the center of the neighborhood it depicted. The clock tower loomed above me, its face cracked and frozen at midnight. The fountain was dry, its surface littered with scattered coins, each one etched with a symbol I didn't recognize. The watching tree was unlike any tree I'd ever seen. Its bark was black, its branches twisted into unnatural shapes. The map's instruction echoed in my head like a chant. Find what's missing. When I woke, the map was lying on my nightstand, even though I'd left it in my jacket. That was the first time I noticed the changes. The next morning, as I walked to the bus stop, the world seemed wrong. The air felt heavier, and the streets were too quiet, as though the city was holding its breath. The coffee shop on the corner one I passed every day, was closed. Its windows were dark, the name painted on the glass now faded beyond recognition. When I asked the barista at a different shop what had happened, she just stared at me. "There's never been a coffee shop there," she said, frowning. I let it go, but the unease stayed with me. By the end of the week, more places were gone. The bookstore where I bought the map was boarded up, the street name on its sign replaced by blank metal. A man I'd seen every morning walking his dog no longer appeared, and when I mentioned him to a neighbor, they shook their head. No one like that lives here. I unfolded the map again that night, staring at the intricate lines and unfamiliar landmarks. This time, I noticed something new. The watching tree was glowing faintly, its ink shimmering in the dim light. Beneath it, another note had appeared, written in the same sharp hand. "It's waiting for you." I wasn't sure what compelled me to follow it. The neighborhood on the map didn't exist, at least not on any GPS app one could find. But when I walked through the city the next day, taking random turns and trusting my instincts, I found myself standing in front of the clock tower from my dream. The world seemed different here. The air was colder, the colors muted, the sounds muffled. The streets were empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I approached the fountain, its dry basin exactly as I'd seen in my dream. The coins scattered across the stone surface glinted faintly, their strange symbols catching the light. I reached down to pick one up, and as my fingers brushed the metal, the ground beneath me trembled. A sound like distant whispers filled the air. I turned toward the watching tree. Up close, it was even more grotesque. The bark seemed to pulse, as though something alive moved just beneath its surface. The branches twisted toward the sky like reaching hands, and the ground around its roots was blackened and cracked. I took a step closer, the map clenched tightly in my hand. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the tree itself was calling to me. At the base of the tree, half buried in the dirt, was a small wooden box. I hesitated, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But something about the box drew me in. It was plain and unmarked, but it felt heavy with importance. I knelt down and opened it. Inside was a single object, a pocket watch. The moment I touched it, the world around me shifted. The clock tower's face shattered, its frozen hands spinning wildly. The fountain erupted with black water, spilling over the sides and staining the cobblestones. The watching tree groaned, its branches twisting violently as the whispers became a deafening roar. And then everything went still. I was no longer in the neighborhood. I stood in a vast, featureless expanse, the ground beneath me smooth and white, stretching endlessly in every direction. The air was silent, heavy with an unnatural stillness. The pocket watch in my hand ticked once, and a figure emerged from the emptiness. It was humanoid, but its edges blurred, as though it couldn't fully exist in this space. Its voice, when it spoke, was a layered, discordant chorus. "You found what's missing," it said. "What does that mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head. "This place was never meant to be seen. The map was a door, and you opened it." I looked down at the pocket watch, its hands spinning erratically. "What happens now?" The figure smiled, its face stretching unnaturally wide. "Now you stay." The ground beneath me cracked, and I fell. I woke in my apartment, gasping for air. The map was gone, and the pocket watch sat on my nightstand, its ticking impossibly loud. But the world isn't the same. The streets outside are too empty, the sky too gray. People smile at me like they know something I don't, their eyes lingering a moment too long. And every night, when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers. The watching tree is still waiting. Let's start a new story. So when the knock came at my apartment door one crisp autumn afternoon, I was surprised. The box was small, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. My name was handwritten on the top in neat, precise lettering, but there was no postage stamp. Someone had delivered it by hand. "Hey, did you see who left this?" I called to the delivery guy who was walking away down the hall, but he didn't respond. He just turned the corner without looking back. I brought the box inside, placing it carefully on the kitchen counter. The paper was smooth, almost waxy to the touch. I hesitated for a moment before tearing it open. Inside was an old wooden music box. It was small, intricately carved with swirling patterns that looked like vines or roots. Its dark wood gleamed in the light, and there was a brass key sticking out of the side. No note, no explanation. I turned the key a few times and let it play. The melody was haunting, slow and lilting, like a lullaby sung in a forgotten language. It wasn't familiar, but something about it felt ancient, like it carried a memory not my own. The sound filled the apartment, weaving through the air like smoke. And then it stopped, not at the end of the tune, not with a final note. It just cut off abruptly, leaving the room too quiet. That was the first night I heard the knocking. It came from somewhere inside the apartment, a soft but deliberate tap, tap, tap against the wall. I froze, listening, and the knocks came again, closer this time. I checked the doors, the windows, the vents, but there was nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint echo of my own breathing. The music box sat on the counter, its lid slightly ajar. By the next morning, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, amplified by too much caffeine and a stressful week. I tucked the music box into a drawer, determined to forget about it. But it didn't let me. Every night, the knocks came back. Always 3, always closer. And then, after the third night, I woke to find the music box on my nightstand. I knew I hadn't put it there. Its lid was open, the key turned as if it had played during the night. The melody echoed faintly in my head, like a dream I couldn't fully remember. I moved it to the closet, shoving it deep into a pile of old clothes. But when I came home that evening, it was on the coffee table, perfectly centered, the brass key gleaming like it had been freshly polished. I tried to throw it away. I drove to a dumpster several blocks from my apartment and hurled it in without looking back. The next morning, it was back on the counter. That's when I noticed the scratches. They started small, faint lines on the walls that I thought might have been there all along. But over the next few days, they grew deeper, more erratic, sprawling like claw marks etched by something trying to escape. I started hearing whispers, low and indecipherable, threading through the apartment like a chorus of voices just out of reach. At first, I thought they were coming from the vents, but no matter where I stood, they always seemed to be behind me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the music box and drove to the edge of town, to an old quarry that had been fenced off years ago. The place was desolate, the kind of spot you'd see in a movie where bad things happen. I climbed to the edge of the pit and threw the music box as hard as I could. I watched it tumble down into the darkness, bouncing off the jagged rocks below until it disappeared entirely. For the first time in days, I felt a shred of relief. It lasted exactly one night. The next morning it was back. This time, it wasn't alone. When I walked into the kitchen, the music box sat on the counter as usual, but now there was something next to it, a photograph. It was an old black and white photo, the edges worn and yellowed. In it, a young woman stood in front of a house I didn't recognize, holding the music box in her hands. Her face was blurry, as though she'd been moving when the photo was taken, but her eyes were sharp and piercing, fixed directly on the camera. Directly on me. The whispers grew louder after that, no longer confined to the edges of my perception. They called my name now, their tones urgent and demanding. And the knocks, they weren't just knocks anymore. They were footsteps, soft but deliberate, pacing the apartment at all hours of the night. The walls bled scratches like veins, stretching across the surfaces in jagged, intricate patterns that began to resemble the carvings on the music box. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just sat in the corner of the living room, watching the box, waiting for whatever was coming next. And then last night it happened. The music box started playing on its own. The melody was slower this time, deeper, as though the notes were sinking into the floor. The air in the apartment grew heavy, suffocating, and the whispers rose to a deafening roar. And then I saw it. A figure, barely more than a shadow, unfolded itself from the darkness by the kitchen. It was tall and skeletal, its limbs too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was blank, except for the eyes, two burning orbs that locked onto me with impossible intensity. It reached for the music box, its bony fingers caressing the lid with something like reverence. And then it turned to me. "You opened it." It rasped, its voice like grinding stone. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I remember is the music box playing its final, mournful note as the figure stepped closer, its shadow swallowing me whole. When I woke, the apartment was empty. The music box was gone. So were the scratches, the whispers, the photographs. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear the melody again, faint and distant. And I know it's not over. Let's start a new story. It was an old, battered sedan, its headlights dull and uneven. At first, I thought nothing of it. Rural roads are often quiet, and seeing another car can feel like a relief. But something about the way it moved caught my attention. It wasn't trying to pass me, even though the road was empty. It didn't hang back at a comfortable distance either. It stayed close, almost too close, its headlights glaring in my rearview mirror. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, tightening my grip on the steering wheel. Maybe they were distracted. Maybe they just weren't paying attention to the space between us. I sped up slightly, hoping to put some distance between us. The sedan matched my speed. I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, trying to make out the driver's face, but the windshield was dark. Just an empty shadow. The road ahead stretched out endlessly, the darkness swallowing everything beyond the narrow beam of my headlights. Trees lined both sides, their silhouettes jagged and gnarled. It was the kind of road where losing cell service wasn't a possibility. It was a certainty. I took a deep breath, telling myself to relax. Maybe they were heading to the same place I was or somewhere nearby. Just a coincidence. But the car stayed with me, its headlights burning into my mirrors. I turned on my blinker and pulled onto a smaller side road, one I knew would eventually loop back to the main highway. The sedan followed, its turn signal clicking on a second after mine. That's when I knew. I wasn't imagining things. The small road was narrower, the trees pressing closer, their branches arching over the pavement. My heart thudded in my chest as I accelerated, hoping to lose them. The sedan kept pace, its headlights unwavering. I tried to think rationally. Maybe I could pull over, let them pass. Maybe I was overreacting, but every instinct screamed at me not to stop. Ahead, I saw a split in the road. I veered right, taking the sharper turn, and glanced in my side mirror to see if they'd keep following. The sedan took the same turn. I was officially scared now. My palms were slick on the wheel, my breath coming faster. The logical part of my brain struggled to make sense of the situation. Why were they following me? What did they want? Up ahead, I spotted an old gas station, its sign flickering weakly in the darkness. Relief flooded through me. I'd pull in there, where it was lit and hopefully staffed. If nothing else, I wouldn't be alone. I turned into the lot, my tires crunching on gravel. The sedan slowed and then rolled past, continuing down the road. My body sagged with relief as I parked near the pumps and killed the engine. The gas station was quiet. Too quiet. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered unevenly, and the shelves were half empty. A lone cashier stood behind the counter, a bored teenager scrolling on his phone. I stepped inside, letting the bell over the door announce my presence. "Everything okay?" the cashier asked without looking up. I hesitated, glancing out the window. The road beyond was empty now, the sedan long gone. "Yeah, Elite. Just needed a break." He nodded, uninterested. I wandered the aisles, pretending to browse while trying to shake the lingering unease. I told myself it was over, that I'd been paranoid, that the sedan was just a coincidence. Then I saw it, parked across the street, just barely visible in the weak glow of the gas station lights, was the sedan. It was facing the building, its headlights off, but I could feel it watching me. My stomach twisted into a knot. I turned back toward the cashier, trying to act casual. "Is there another way out of here?" I asked. The kid raised an eyebrow. "You mean besides the road?" "Yeah, like a back exit or something." He shrugged. "Not really." "Why?" I didn't answer. My mouth was too dry to speak. When I glanced back out the window, the sedan was gone. I paid for a bottle of water I didn't need and walked back to my car. forcing myself not to run. The lot was still empty, the road eerily quiet. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. I pulled out onto the road, keeping my speed steady, my eyes darting between the mirrors and the dark stretch ahead. For the first few minutes, there was nothing, just the empty road and the hum of my engine. Then the headlights appeared, far back at first, barely a pinprick of light in the rearview mirror. But they grew closer, steadily gaining ground, until I recognized the uneven glare of the sedan. Panic bubbled in my chest. I pushed the gas pedal harder, my car surging forward. The sedan matched my speed, closing the distance between us again. This time, I didn't try to lose them. I just drove, my focus narrowing to the road ahead. The trees blurred into dark smears on either side, the world shrinking to the twin beams of my headlights. Then, without warning, the sedan turned off its lights. The road plunged into deeper darkness. I could still hear the faint rumble of its engine behind me, but the headlights were gone, as if it had vanished into the night. I wanted to stop, to pull over and breathe, but I couldn't bring myself to slow down. The air inside the car felt heavy, oppressive, and then I saw them, figures, standing at the edge of the road, just beyond the reach of my headlights. At first, I thought they were trees, the branches shifting in the wind. But as I got closer, I saw the shapes more clearly, tall, thin, with elongated limbs that seemed to twist unnaturally. They didn't move as I passed, but I felt their eyes on me. The sedan's engine rumbled louder behind me, and when I glanced in the mirror, I saw its headlights flicker back on. I don't remember the rest of the drive, just a blur of darkness and motion, the figures on the roadside multiplying with every mile. When I finally reached the main highway, the sedan was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached home, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. I still don't know who or what was in that car, but sometimes on quiet nights, I dream of headlights in the distance, and I wake up, heart pounding, certain they've found me again. Let's start a new story. The thing had been ordered months ago, one of those odd little artifacts you find while doom scrolling late at night. I couldn't even remember why I'd bought it. The listing had described it as a unique timepiece of unknown origin, which in hindsight probably should have raised a red flag. But it was cheap, and I was bored. When the delivery finally showed up, it was wrapped in layers of tape and stamped with shipping labels from countries I couldn't place on a map. I pulled it open with scissors, expecting something delicate or vintage, but what I found instead was disappointing. It was a clock, but not the elegant antique I'd imagined. The face was covered in faint scratches, the brass hands tarnished and bent slightly out of alignment. The frame was a strange, dark metal, cold and rough to the touch, and the back panel was sealed shut with tiny screws. There was no visible mechanism for winding it, no battery compartment, just a single small key tied to the top with a faded ribbon. Still, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I set it on the mantel in my living room, thinking it might make for an interesting conversation piece, and promptly forgot about it. That night, I woke to the sound of ticking. At first, I thought it was coming from the wall clock in the kitchen, but as I shuffled toward the sound, still groggy and half asleep, I realized it was coming from the living room. The clock on the mantel was ticking. I frowned, leaning in closer. The hands were moving, slowly, unevenly, but I hadn't wound it. I hadn't done anything to it. The sound was hypnotic, each tick echoing louder than it should in the quiet room. I reached out, curious, and touched the glass covering the face. The ticking stopped. I yanked my hand back, startled by the sudden silence. For a moment, I stared at the clock, unsure if I'd imagined the whole thing. But then the second hand jerked forward again, resuming its uneven rhythm. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, the clock was different. The hands weren't marking the current time. They were set to 9:53, a moment that meant nothing to me. Thinking it might have just stopped, I reached for the little key tied to the top. As I inserted it into a barely visible hole on the side and turned, I felt resistance, like the mechanism was old and reluctant to move. When the key clicked into place, the room shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No flashing lights, no disorienting blur, just a subtle wrongness. The air felt heavier, The colors in the room dimmed slightly, like the world had been drained of something vital. And then the phone rang. I don't get many calls, especially not early in the morning. My stomach twisted as I picked it up, the ticking of the clock loud in my ears. Hello? There was silence on the other end, followed by a faint, crackling breath. Who is this? I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. The voice that answered was my own. Don't wind the clock again. The line went dead. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the phone, my pulse hammering. My first thought was that it was some kind of prank, an elaborate, cruel trick, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something far stranger was happening. The clock ticked louder now, its rhythm quickening, uneven and frantic. The hands were spinning faster than they should, the second hand dragging the minute hand along with it. I tried to turn away, to walk out of the room, but I couldn't. The clock held my attention like a magnet. The faster it ticked, the more the air around me seemed to hum, a low vibration that resonated in my bones. And then it stopped. The silence was suffocating. I blinked, and the room wasn't mine anymore. The walls were the same shape, but the paint was peeling, and the furniture was gone. The air was thick with dust, the faint smell of mildew clinging to every breath. Outside the window, the sky was a washed-out gray, featureless and heavy. I stumbled back, disoriented, my gaze darting around the unfamiliar space. The clock was still on the mantel, but its hands had stopped at 3:12. The front door creaked open, slow and deliberate. Hello? I called out, my voice small in the empty room. There was no answer, but I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy against the floorboards. A figure stepped into view. It looked like me, but it wasn't. The face was wrong, the features slightly skewed, like someone had tried to recreate my appearance from memory and failed. Its eyes locked onto mine, cold and empty, and it smiled, a slow, mechanical movement that didn't reach the rest of its face. You should have listened, it said, its voice low and metallic, each word punctuated by a faint ticking sound. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair that wasn't there before. What is this? I demanded, my voice breaking. What's happening? The figure tilted its head, the smile never faltering. You wound the clock, it said, as if that explained everything. It took a step closer, and I saw something glinting in its hand, a small, ornate key. My key. I ran. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, the door at the end shrinking with every step. The ticking grew louder, overlapping, drowning out everything else. When I finally reached the door and threw it open, I found myself back in my living room. The clock was still there, its hands spinning backward now, faster and faster. The phone rang again. This time, I didn't answer, but the voice came anyway, emanating from the clock itself, layered and distorted. You set it in motion. Now it's your turn. The glass face of the clock cracked, and the room began to dissolve. And as the world unraveled around me, I realized something terrible. The hands of the clock weren't counting time. They were counting me. Let's start a new story. Normal storm. Not the kind you watch roll in over the horizon with rumbling clouds and a cool breeze warning you to take cover. This one came out of nowhere, a midnight chaos of thunder, so loud it shook the apartment, and rain that pounded like fists against my windows. The power went out almost immediately, leaving me fumbling for my phone as the walls seemed to hum with the weight of the downpour. When the storm ended as suddenly as it had begun, the silence felt unnaturally heavy. I stayed awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling until the first hints of dawn crept in through the blinds. And that's when things began to shift. The first clue was small, almost insignificant. My toothbrush. When I reached for it that morning, it was in the wrong spot, standing neatly in its holder instead of lying across the sink where I always left it. I didn't think much of it. Maybe I'd been half asleep when I'd moved it. Maybe I was just tired. But that evening, when I got home from work, it was back on the sink, perfectly aligned with the edge like it had never left. The next day, the same thing happened with my keys. I always hung them on the hook by the door. Always. But when I went to grab them, they weren't there. After tearing through the apartment, I found them on the kitchen counter, sitting next to the coffee pot like they'd been waiting for me. It was unsettling, sure, but easy enough to rationalize. Stress, forgetfulness, nothing out of the ordinary. Until it wasn't. The pattern started small and unassuming, but they grew louder with each passing day. A pair of shoes I'd left by the door moved to the closet. A book I'd been reading disappeared from the nightstand, only to reappear on the coffee table a day later. My phone would vibrate with notifications that vanished when I checked. And then there was the clock. The first time I noticed it, I was getting ready for bed. The clock on the microwave blinked 10:17 p.m., which seemed strange because my phone said it was just after 9. I reset it, thinking it might have glitched during the storm. The next night, it blinked 10:17 again. No matter how many times I reset it, no matter the time of day, it always ended up there, 10:17. It didn't take long for the time to start showing up elsewhere. My phone, my computer, even my wristwatch, which wasn't digital and shouldn't have been able to reset itself. They all froze at 10:17. By the end of the week, I started seeing the number everywhere, scratched into the wood of a park bench, graffitied on an alley wall, even scrawled in the condensation on my bathroom mirror after a shower. I tried ignoring it. I told myself it was a coincidence, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, unable to sleep, I sat on the couch, flipping through the TV channels for distraction. The static-filled screen flickered between nonsense programs, their audio distorted and strange, until it landed on a blank channel that glowed faintly. At first, I thought it was empty, just a pale, snowy screen. But as I leaned closer, I saw movement, a faint, flickering shadow in the background. It grew clearer by the second, until I realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was me. I was on the screen, sitting in the same spot, wearing the same clothes, holding the same remote. But something was wrong. My movements were a second ahead of my own. I watched frozen, as the me on the screen turned its head and looked directly into the camera. It smiled. I threw the remote, the screen going black as it clattered to the floor. My heart pounded as I stared at the TV, its dark surface reflecting the room around me. Everything looked normal, but then I saw it. In the reflection, standing just behind me, was a figure, a shadowy outline, its edges shimmering faintly like heat waves on asphalt. I spun around, but the room was empty. That night, I didn't sleep. The following days were a blur of paranoia and fear. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Mirrors became my enemy. Their reflections felt wrong, delayed, like they were considering my movements before deciding to mimic them. The sound of the clock ticking in the hallway felt louder, more deliberate, like each second was a choice it had made. And then on the 7th day after the storm, it happened. I woke up at exactly 10:17 p.m., drenched in sweat, the air in my apartment thick and electric. The hum was back, that strange, vibrating sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. A single notification glowed on the screen. "Come see." The message had no sender. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay in bed, I got up. The air seemed to pulse around me as I walked to the living room, each step echoing like I was walking through a vast, empty cavern. When I reached the window, I froze. Outside, the street was unrecognizable. The buildings were there, but they were wrong. Stretched, their angles warped, their surfaces shimmering like reflections on water. The sky was black, not the gentle darkness of night, but an all-consuming void, broken only by a single, brilliant light in the distance. The light pulsed faintly, growing brighter with each beat. It felt like it was calling me. I don't remember walking outside. One moment, I was staring at the window. The next, I was standing in the middle of the street, the world around me silent and still. The light loomed closer now, impossibly large and brilliant. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. In its place stood me, or something that looked like me. The figure was identical in every way. Same face, same clothes, even the same scar above my left eyebrow. But its eyes, they were hollow, reflecting nothing but the void behind it. It smiled just like the reflection in the TV. "You're late," it said, its voice a perfect echo of mine. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could say a word, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment. Everything was exactly as it had been before the storm. The toothbrush was on the sink, the clock ticked forward as normal, and the mirrors reflected what they should. But every now and then, when I glance at a screen or catch my reflection, I see it. The other me watching and waiting. Let's start a new story. Flag. I was broke between freelance gigs and desperate enough to consider moving back in with my parents when I stumbled across the listing. It was vague, but promising. Personal archivist needed immediate start. The pay was absurdly high, and the location, a secluded estate on the outskirts of town, sounded almost too good to be true. I applied on a whim, not expecting to hear back. When I got the call 2 hours later, I should have been suspicious. But desperation is louder than instinct, and the voice on the other end sounded professional, warm even. "Mr. Albrecht was very impressed with your application," the woman said. "He'd like you to start immediately, if possible." The estate was exactly what you'd imagine for an eccentric millionaire. Sprawling grounds, towering iron gates, and a house that looked like it had been plucked from a Gothic novel. When I arrived, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a stiff bun greeted me at the door. "I'm Mrs. Harlow, Mr. Albrecht's housekeeper," she said briskly, ushering me inside. "Your duties will primarily involve organizing and cataloging Mr. Albrecht's collection. He values discretion above all else." She didn't elaborate on what the collection entailed, and I didn't ask. The pay was good enough to justify a little mystery. The first day passed uneventfully. The library, where I'd be working, was a massive room with walls of dark oak and shelves that stretched to the ceiling. It smelled faintly of old paper and varnish, with a lingering hint of something metallic I couldn't place. The collection was overwhelming. Boxes of faded photographs, stacks of handwritten journals, maps that looked older than the country itself. I spent hours sorting through the chaos, losing myself in the rhythm of organizing. It wasn't until late afternoon that I noticed something strange. One of the journals I'd been cataloging was filled with names, all written in the same precise, spidery handwriting. At first, I thought it was a guest list or a ledger of some kind, but there were no dates, no accompanying details, just page after page of names. And at the very bottom of the last page, in darker ink as though it had been written more recently, was my own name, Elliot Harper. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was a different Elliot Harper. Or maybe, "Is everything all right, Mr. Harper?" I jumped, nearly dropping the journal. Mrs. Harlow stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes fixed on me. "Yeah," I said quickly, snapping the journal shut. "Just a little tired." She didn't respond, but her gaze lingered a second too long before she nodded and disappeared back into the hallway. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the journal. I lay awake in the small, sparse room they'd given me, the sound of the wind rattling the old windows. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of faint tapping. It was soft, rhythmic, and coming from the direction of the library. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind. But as the tapping continued, something about it felt deliberate, like someone or something was knocking, waiting. Against my better judgment, I got up and crept down the hall. The tapping grew louder as I approached the library, a steady, unnatural rhythm that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. When I reached the door, it stopped. The room was empty, just as I'd left it. The boxes were neatly stacked, the desk lamp still glowing faintly. But the journal, the one with my name in it, was open on the desk. I was certain I'd closed it earlier. The name at the bottom of the list was no longer mine. It was someone else's, Vivian Harlow. I heard the sound of a floorboard creaking behind me and turned sharply. No one was there. The next morning, I tried to tell myself it was stress, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But Mrs. Harlow's demeanor had changed. She seemed distracted, her sharpness replaced by a strange, uneasy quiet. By the third day, things had escalated. The journals weren't where I'd left them. The photographs had been rearranged, and I started finding objects that didn't belong. An antique watch ticking faintly in a drawer I hadn't opened, a glass vial filled with something dark and viscous tucked between the pages of a book. And then there were the shadows. They started out small, just flickers in the corner of my eye. But as the week went on, they grew bolder, lingering in doorways, stretching across the walls in impossible shapes. Once, while reaching for a book on the highest shelf, I caught sight of my own reflection in the library's glass cabinets. It wasn't moving. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over the ladder. When I looked again, the reflection was gone, but the chill in the air remained. By the 5th day, I decided I couldn't stay. I didn't care about the money, didn't care about finishing the job. I packed my bag that night, planning to leave before anyone could stop me. As I stepped into the hallway, I saw him for the first time. Mr. Albrecht. He was standing at the far end of the corridor, his face hidden in shadow. He was taller than I expected, his frame angular and rigid, like something built rather than born. "Going somewhere, Mr. Harper?" he asked, his voice low and resonant, each word heavy with something I couldn't name. Yeah, you still admit something's come up, and I need to leave." His head tilted slightly, like a predator considering its prey. "You've seen it, haven't you?" "Seen what?" "The list," he said simply. My blood turned to ice. "You're not the first, you know," he continued, stepping closer. "The house chooses. It always has." I backed away, my hand tightening around the strap of my bag. "I don't know what you're talking about." His smile was thin, humorless. "You will." The lights flickered, and for a moment, the hallway was plunged into darkness. When they came back on, he was gone. I didn't stay to question it. I ran. When I reached the gates, they were already open, as though the house had decided to let me go. The wind whipped through the trees as I sped down the road, the estate shrinking in my rearview mirror. But I can't escape it. This morning, I found a package on my doorstep. Inside was the journal, the spidery handwriting unmistakable. There's only one name in it now, Elliot Harper, and the ink is still wet. Let's start a new story. No footsteps, no creaking doors. It was a soft hum, barely audible, like the faint vibration of electricity running through the walls. I first noticed it one night while lying in bed, the world outside my window dark and still. I thought it was my phone, maybe a notification or some app running in the background. But when I reached over to check, the phone was silent. The hum was coming from somewhere else. It wasn't intrusive, just there. A background static, I told myself, was part of the urban soundscape. I ignored it and fell asleep. The next morning, I felt strange. Not sick, not tired, just off. It was like I couldn't quite connect with myself. My hands felt unfamiliar, like they belonged to someone else. And when I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I felt a jarring sense of disconnection. My face looked the same, but for a split second, it felt like I was looking at a picture of myself rather than a reflection. I shook it off as stress. Work had been demanding lately, and I'd been skipping meals, running on caffeine and takeout. That kind of lifestyle plays tricks on you, right? At least, that's what I told myself. But the hum didn't go away. If anything, it got louder. Over the next week, I noticed other things. My clock started acting strangely, ticking irregularly, sometimes stopping entirely for a few seconds before picking up again. The shadows in my apartment seemed to linger just a moment too long after the lights turned off, as if reluctant to leave. My belongings weren't where I remembered putting them. My keys would turn up in the fridge, my laptop on the bathroom counter. Small things, easily dismissible if they weren't adding up. Then I lost time. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I'd just gotten back from running errands. I set the grocery bags on the counter, started unpacking, and blinked. When I looked up, the groceries were gone, and the clock read 7:13 p.m. 3 hours had vanished. My shoes were off, my jacket was hung up neatly by the door, and the dishes I'd left in the sink earlier were clean and drying on the rack. It was as if someone had come in and finished my chores while I wasn't paying attention. Or as if I'd done it myself. I checked my phone, but there were no missed calls, no messages, nothing to account for the gap. I sat on the couch, trying to calm the rising panic. Maybe I was overworked. Maybe I'd zoned out. People do that, right? But deep down, I knew something was wrong. And the hum? It was louder than ever. That night, I woke up at 3:18 a.m. My room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight outside, but I could feel something was different. The hum had stopped. At first, I was relieved. The absence of the sound was almost calming. But then I realized how quiet it was. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses in on you. Heavy and suffocating. I sat up, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. That's when I saw it. There was a shape at the foot of my bed. Not a person, not exactly. It was indistinct, like a shadow pulled free from the wall, but denser somehow, more solid. It didn't move, but I felt its presence, an overwhelming sense of wrongness. My chest tightened, my breath hitching as I stared at it. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. It didn't answer. It didn't need to. As I stared, I realized the shadow wasn't just sitting there. It was watching me. I couldn't see eyes or a face, but I felt its gaze, cold and invasive, like it was peeling back the layers of me, looking at something deeper, something I didn't even know was there. Then it moved. It didn't lunge or reach for me. It simply stood, unfolding itself with an unnatural grace. And as it did, I realized it wasn't casting a shadow. It was the shadow. It stretched toward the wall, merging with the darkness there, and disappeared. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I tried to convince myself it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But when I went to brush my teeth, there was something new in the bathroom mirror. A crack. It wasn't big, just a small fissure running diagonally across the glass. But I knew it hadn't been there before. I ran my finger along it, the surface smooth to the touch. It wasn't on the outside. It was inside the mirror. Over the next few days, the crack grew. It branched out like a web, intricate and almost beautiful, until the entire mirror was covered in fractures. But it wasn't just the bathroom mirror. Every reflective surface in my apartment started to change. My phone screen, the microwave door, even the glass on picture frames, they all began to distort. At first, it was subtle, a warping at the edges. But then the reflections themselves started to shift. They didn't match me anymore. When I turned my head, the reflections moved a split second too late. When I raised my hand, the version of me in the glass hesitated, as if unsure what to do. And sometimes it didn't move at all. Last night, I tried covering the mirrors, but it didn't help. As I lay in bed, the hum returned, louder than ever, vibrating through my skull. I closed my eyes, pressing my hands over my ears, but the sound was inside me now, resonating in my bones. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't human. It wasn't a sound at all, not really. It was a feeling, a weight pressing into my mind, forcing itself into my thoughts. "You were never meant to stay." I sat up, gasping, my body drenched in sweat. The hum stopped abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. My room was empty, but I felt it again, that gaze, watching me from somewhere I couldn't see. This morning, I woke up to find my reflection staring at me from the closet door. I hadn't gotten out of bed yet. It smiled. I don't know what's happening to me, but I know one thing. The hum isn't just a sound. It's something alive, something that's been waiting. And I think somehow it's waking up. Or maybe I am. Let's start a new story. War, the soft vanilla and cedar mix that felt like home, but something sharper. It clung to her clothes faintly, like smoke that lingered after a fire. At first, I thought it might have been her coworker, the one who chain-smoked outside their office. But it wasn't cigarettes. It was cologne, the expensive kind, the kind that hangs in the air after someone walks by, daring you to ask who it belongs to. I didn't say anything that first time. It felt small, stupid even, to let my mind wander into paranoia over a scent. People move through spaces and pick up the traces of others without even realizing it. That's what I told myself. It wasn't until I noticed the messages that the doubts began to take shape. Maya always used to leave her phone lying around, her lock screen cluttered with unread notifications. But lately, her phone was either in her hand or tucked away in her bag. One night, as she cooked dinner, it buzzed on the counter. I glanced at it, not to snoop, but out of reflex. The message read, "Tomorrow can't come fast enough. I've missed you." It was from C. Just an initial. No full name. No explanation. My chest tightened, but I said nothing. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I didn't want to seem like the insecure boyfriend who couldn't trust her. So I let it slide, but the unease didn't slide with it. It grew. Little things started to add up. Longer work hours, more girls' nights, and an unfamiliar playlist she started humming along to in the car. Maya didn't hum. She was the type to belt out songs off-key, her voice filling every corner of our lives. But now her humming was quiet, subdued, like it wasn't meant for me to hear. The final thread unraveled on a Thursday night. She came home late, her excuse as seamless as ever. "Sorry," she said, hanging her coat by the door. "There was a problem with one of the client accounts, and we had to stay and sort it out." I nodded, watching as she kicked off her heels and went straight to the shower. When she came out, her face scrubbed clean, she seemed lighter, as if whatever tension had followed her home had been washed away. But as I sat alone in the living room, the faintest flicker of curiosity pushed me to check her coat pocket. I told myself it was just to find something harmless, something that would put my mind at ease, a receipt, maybe, or her office key card. Instead, I found a room key. It was for the Fulton Inn, a boutique hotel across town, a place we'd never been together. My stomach churned as I turned it over in my hand. There was no logical explanation for this. None that made sense for someone who'd just been working late. When she walked back into the living room, drying her hair with a towel, I held up the key. "What's this?" I asked, my voice calm despite the storm brewing in my chest. She froze, the towel slipping from her hands. For the first time in years, Maya looked at me like I was a stranger. "It's not what you think," she said quickly, her words tripping over each other. "Then what is it?" I asked. I wasn't angry yet, just tired, exhausted from carrying around questions with no answers. She sat down on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It's for work," she said finally. "We had to book a room for a client meeting, and I must have forgotten to return the key." It was a decent lie. Too decent. The kind of lie you only practice if you're planning on using it. I didn't press her. Not then. Instead, I nodded and said, "Okay," but I didn't let it go. The next day, I left work early and drove to the Fulton Inn. I told the front desk that I'd left something in my room and needed to know which one was under the name Maya Weston. The clerk, barely out of his teens, didn't even blink. He checked his computer and said, "Room 214. My chest tightened as I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing against the quiet. When I reached the door, I stood there for a long time, my hand hovering over the handle. I didn't know what I expected to find. Evidence? Closure? A reason to forgive her? I pushed the door open. The room was spotless, the bed made, the air heavy with the faint scent of that cologne. On the desk, there was a single wine glass, the rim smudged with red lipstick. Her lipstick. I left the room without touching anything, my head spinning. On the drive home, I thought about the years we'd spent together, the memories we'd built like bricks in a wall that now seemed to be crumbling around me. I thought about the mornings she'd spent laughing over coffee, the nights we'd stayed up talking about nothing and everything. How much of it had been real? That night, when Maya came home, I didn't wait for her to make excuses. "I know," I said as soon as she walked through the door. Her face crumpled, her shoulders sagging under the weight of whatever she'd been carrying. She didn't deny it, didn't try to deflect or lie. Instead, she sat down and started to cry, her hands shaking as she tried to find the words. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said softly. It just happened." Her explanation didn't matter. The details didn't matter. All I knew was that the Maya I thought I knew, the one who built a life with me, wasn't the same person sitting in front of me now. By the next morning, I was gone. I didn't leave a note. I didn't need to. Some endings are louder than words, echoing in the silence of what's left behind. Let's start a new story. Sleep, when my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The screen lit up, showing a number I didn't recognize. It was 2:12 a.m., the time when nothing good ever happens. I hesitated before answering, the grogginess fading as an uneasy awareness crept in. "Hello?" The line crackled, distant static like an old radio barely tuned to the right frequency. At first I thought it was a prank call. Then I heard it, my voice. "Don't go to work tomorrow." My heart jolted. The voice on the other end was unmistakably mine, but slower, deeper, and tinged with an exhaustion I couldn't place. "What?" I whispered, my throat dry. "Just listen. Stay home. Don't ask why." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the screen, the call already erased from my recent history. I sat there for a long time, the weight of the silence pressing down on me. By morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. I went to work. The office felt normal, or at least as normal as any place where the fluorescent lights was like a migraine waiting to happen. The day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was the little things. A coworker, Anna, who always wore bright scarves, was dressed in black. The break room coffee pot had been replaced with a newer model overnight, though no one else seemed to notice. The fire exit at the end of the hall, always locked, hung slightly ajar. And then there was the elevator. I worked on the 17th floor, so the elevator was a necessary part of my daily routine. It was slow, temperamental, and prone to jamming between floors, but today it felt different. When I stepped inside, the air was heavy, colder than usual. The mirrored walls reflected my face back at me, but something about the reflection felt wrong. The angle was off, the lighting distorted, as if the mirror were capturing a version of me that wasn't quite real. I reached out to press the button for my floor, but it was already lit. The doors slid shut with a mechanical groan, and the elevator began its ascent. At first, it seemed normal, the soft hum of the motor lulling me into a false sense of calm. But as the numbers ticked up, 5, 6, 7, the elevator didn't slow. The hum grew louder, almost frantic, the floor indicator blinking erratically. 10, 15, 20. "Stop," I muttered, pressing the emergency button. Nothing happened. The walls began to shake, the mirror vibrating so violently that I thought it might shatter. The air grew colder still, my breath fogging up the glass. Then it stopped. The elevator jolted to a halt, the sudden stillness almost more jarring than the motion. The floor indicator read 17, but the doors didn't open. Instead, the lights flickered, plunging me into brief, suffocating darkness. When the lights came back on, I wasn't alone. There was someone else in the elevator with me, standing in the far corner, their face obscured by the dim light. They were dressed like me, same black coat, same gray scarf, but their posture was wrong, slouched and predatory, like a marionette whose strings had been cut. "Hello," I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. Slowly, I took a step back, pressing myself against the cold metal wall. The air felt electric, humming with a pressure that made my ears ache. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Then the figure stepped forward. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, and too fast, like frames skipping in an old film. The face that emerged from the shadows was my own, but distorted, the eyes sunken and dark, the skin pale and stretched. It smiled, a slow, jagged thing that didn't belong on any human face. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice a raspy echo of my own. I slammed my hand against the emergency button again and again, my fingers trembling, until the elevator shuddered and the doors finally slid open. I stumbled out into the hallway, my chest heaving, and turned back to look. The elevator was empty. I didn't go back to work after that. I told HR I needed time off, made up some excuse about family issues. They didn't question it, but the warnings didn't stop. Every night, the phone rings. It's always the same number, and I never answer, but the voicemail is always waiting. My own voice, calm and measured, telling me to stay away, to lock my doors, to keep my curtains closed. Sometimes, I hear footsteps in the hall outside my apartment, slow and deliberate, like someone is pacing just beyond the door. When I look through the peephole, there's never anyone there. But I know better now. I know it's watching. Last night, I woke up to find my phone buzzing on the nightstand. This time, the call wasn't from an unknown number. It was my own. I didn't answer. But when the voicemail came through, I listened. It wasn't my voice this time. It was laughter. Low, guttural, and endless. Let's start a new story. Leave your windows open after dark. It's not the kind of thing you'll find in the welcome packet when you move here, but the locals make sure you know. They'll mention it casually at first, a friendly heads up. Careful about the windows at night, gets drafty. If you ignore them, they'll get more insistent. You really ought to keep those shut, you know? Things come in by the time you hear the stories. The ones that sound too detailed to be made up. You'll already have started locking your windows every night without fail, whether you believe or not. I moved to Grisham Falls 2 months ago. I wasn't running from anything, just looking for a quiet place to settle, a slower pace of life. The town had a quaint charm to it. Cobblestone streets, a diner where everyone seemed to know each other, and a river that wound its way through the valley like a silver ribbon. My rental house was small but cozy, with a big bay window in the living room that overlooked the woods. During the day, sunlight poured in, warming the worn hardwood floors. At night, though, the window turned into a black void, reflecting the room back at me like a dark, warped mirror. The warning started the first week. Mrs. Danner from next door caught me on the porch one evening, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She was friendly enough, but her smile faded when she glanced past me into the house. "Windows shut tonight?" she asked casually, her tone too light to be casual. Yeah, of course, I lied. I'd left the bay window cracked open to let in the cool evening breeze. She stared at me for a long moment before nodding. "Good. You'll sleep better that way." I didn't think much of it until the next day when I stopped by the diner. The waitress, a girl not much older than 20, gave me a tight smile when I mentioned the nice weather. "Just remember," she said, lowering her voice, "cool air isn't worth the risk." "The risk?" I asked, half laughing. Her expression didn't change. "Windows. Keep them closed at night." That night, curiosity got the better of me. I left the bay window open again, just a crack. Nothing happened, of course. No monsters crept inside. No shadowy figures pressed against the glass. Just the sound of crickets and the distant rush of the river. It became a game, a way to push back against the town's odd superstition. Each night, I'd leave a different window open, sometimes the kitchen, sometimes the upstairs bathroom, and wait. Each morning, I woke to find everything exactly as I'd left it. Then, one night, the game stopped being fun. It was late, past midnight, and I was sitting on the couch reading a book. The bay window was open, just slightly, the curtains fluttering with the breeze. Everything was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the house. That's when I heard it, a soft scratching sound, faint but deliberate, coming from outside. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was too rhythmic, too controlled. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound came again, louder this time, like fingernails dragging across wood. Slowly, I turned my head toward the bay window. There was something there, a shape, just beyond the glass. I couldn't make it out clearly. Only the faint outline of a figure, tall and angular, standing motionless in the darkness. Its head tilted slightly, almost curiously, and I could feel its gaze even though I couldn't see its eyes. The scratching stopped. I didn't move, didn't breathe, and then it spoke. Not in words exactly. The sound wasn't anything I could describe. Wet and guttural, like a voice trying to push through static. But somehow, I understood. "Let me in." My throat tightened. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to bolt upstairs and lock myself in my room, but I couldn't move. I could only sit there, staring at the thing beyond the window, as it repeated its plea. "Let me in." Its head tilted further, the angle unnatural, wrong, and I realized it wasn't just standing there. It was leaning closer, closer, closer. With a sudden burst of strength, I leapt from the couch and slammed the window shut, locking it with shaking hands. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its head straightening slowly, as though considering me. Then it turned and melted into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I tried to tell myself it had been a trick of the light, a dream brought on by too many late nights and too much caffeine. But when I looked at the bay window, I saw the marks. Long, thin scratches etched into the frame, spaced evenly like fingers. I haven't left a window open since. Some nights, though, I hear the scratching, faint and persistent, moving from window to window, as though searching for the one I might have forgotten to lock. And sometimes I hear the voice again. Let me in. The thing is, it doesn't sound angry. It sounds lonely. Let's start a new story. I had moved into the house 2 weeks ago, a creaky old Victorian I'd gotten for next to nothing at an auction. It was a fixer-upper, sure, but I wasn't picky. I worked from home and liked my space. The place was perfect, big enough to stretch out, small enough to feel cozy. At first, everything was fine. The plumbing worked, the roof didn't leak, and the place had good bones, as the realtor kept saying. There were quirks, though. The second floor always felt colder than the rest of the house, even with the heat cranked up. The stairs leading to it groaned loudly, no matter how lightly I stepped. And then there was the smell, a faint, metallic tang I couldn't trace. It wasn't enough to scare me off. I'd always liked old houses. They had personality. Then the lights on the second floor started acting up. It began with the bulb in the hallway flickering every now and then. I chalked it up to bad wiring. When it burned out entirely, I swapped it for a new one, but the flickering didn't stop. Over the next few days, it spread to the bedroom and bathroom lights too. By the end of the first week, the second floor was in near constant darkness. I called an electrician, but when he checked everything, he just shrugged. Wiring's fine, he said, scratching his head. Maybe it's the bulbs? I swapped them all out again. The flickering stopped for about a day, then came back worse than ever. It wasn't just the lights, though. Things started moving. The first time, I was sure it was me being forgetful. I'd left my keys on the kitchen counter before going to bed. But the next morning, they were sitting on the banister of the stairs. I laughed it off. New house, new routines. People lose track of things all the time. But then it happened again and again. A book I'd been reading vanished from my nightstand and turned up in the living room. My phone, which I distinctly remembered plugging into charge, was lying in the bathtub. And always, it was related to the second floor. The book had been left on the couch, but when I walked upstairs with it later, I found a second copy of it sitting neatly on my bed. Identical. My phone was in the bathtub, but when I went to the upstairs bathroom, I found an old, cracked phone in the sink, one I'd never seen before. By the end of the second week, I stopped going up there entirely. That's when the noises started. At first, it was subtle. The creak of footsteps on the stairs, the faint sound of a door opening or closing. I told myself it was an old house settling, but it got louder. One night, I was lying on the couch when I heard something unmistakable, the sound of someone dragging a piece of furniture across the floor above me. I froze. My mind immediately went to intruders. I grabbed a heavy flashlight and crept up the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. When I reached the top, the noises stopped. The furniture was untouched, everything exactly as I'd left it. But the smell was stronger now, metallic and faintly sweet like blood. I decided to sell the house the next morning. But then, that night, something changed. I woke at 3:17 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place, a faint rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the wind against the windows, but then I realized it was coming from the stairs. I sat up, staring at my bedroom door, barely breathing. The tapping grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside my door. I held my breath, and then it spoke. A voice, low and crackling, like a static-filled radio, whispered, "Come upstairs." I didn't move. I couldn't. The voice came again, softer this time. "Come upstairs, Anna. It's waiting." It knew my name. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The screen glitched, lines of static dancing across it. The voice didn't speak again, but I could hear faint breathing on the other side of the door, shallow and uneven. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When daylight came, I decided I couldn't stay another second. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and headed for the front door. It wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled, twisted, or kicked, the door wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were sealed shut, the locks rusted and immovable. It was as if the house itself had decided I wasn't leaving. By noon, I was desperate. I found an old toolbox in the basement and started prying at the windows with a crowbar. That's when I heard it again, the voice. But this time, it wasn't outside my door. It was behind me. I turned slowly, the crowbar shaking in my hands. Standing at the bottom of the basement stairs was a figure. It was wrong. Its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The smell of metal filled the air, thick and choking. It didn't move. It didn't have to, because behind it, I could see the second floor. Not the actual second floor, but some distorted, twisted version of it. The walls pulsed faintly, like they were alive. The flickering light I complained about earlier was now a strobe, casting jagged shadows that moved on their own. And the whispers, they were everywhere. "Come upstairs, Anna," they hissed, overlapping and echoing, growing louder and louder until they drowned out every thought. I don't remember dropping the crowbar. I don't remember running. But I'm back on the second floor now. It's waiting for me here. And this time, I don't think it's letting me leave. Let's start a new story. Guard at an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the kind of work I ever saw myself doing, but the pay was decent, and I needed the money. The building had been closed for over a decade, left to rot after the city built a newer facility downtown. It was huge, 5 stories tall, with long, empty hallways and dozens of rooms filled with the ghosts of old medical equipment. I was told my job was simple. Walk the halls a few times a night, make sure no one had broken in, and report anything suspicious. Easy enough, right? It wasn't until my first shift that I realized just how wrong I'd been. The hospital felt alive in a way that buildings shouldn't. It groaned and creaked constantly, as if it were shifting on its foundations, and the air inside was cold and damp, no matter how warm it was outside. The corridors were lined with flickering fluorescent lights, their pale glow barely enough to push back the shadows. My footsteps echoed in the emptiness, loud and hollow, and I quickly learned to hate the sound. On the first night, nothing much happened. I made my rounds, radioed the supervisor when I'd finished, and spent the rest of the shift sitting in the security office scrolling on my phone. But something about the place didn't sit right with me. It was too quiet, too still, like the building was holding its breath. It wasn't until the third night that things started to get strange. I was walking my usual route, flashlight in hand, when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere down the hall. It was soft at first, almost inaudible, but as I moved closer, it grew louder. The sound echoed through the corridor, bouncing off the walls and making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I stopped in front of one of the old operating rooms, the tapping now loud enough to drown out the hum of the lights. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, my flashlight flickered, the beam cutting in and out like a stuttering heartbeat. The room was empty. There was no one inside, nothing that could have made the noise. But just as I was about to leave, I noticed something on the floor, a single, dark footprint. It was wet, glistening under the weak light, and far too large to be human. I radioed the supervisor, trying to keep my voice steady. He brushed it off, told me it was probably just a leak in the ceiling or a raccoon that had gotten inside. But as I walked back to the security office, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next few nights, the tapping returned, always coming from a different part of the building. Sometimes it was faint and distant, like the sound of rain against glass. Other times, it was loud and insistent, following me down the halls like a second set of footsteps. I stopped reporting it to the supervisor. He'd stopped listening anyway. It wasn't just the tapping, though. There were other things I couldn't explain. One night, as I was passing through the pediatric ward, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. When I turned to look, there was nothing there, just an empty wheelchair sitting in the middle of the hallway. I walked past it quickly, my pulse racing, but when I glanced back, the wheelchair was gone. Another time, I found a message scrawled on one of the walls in what looked like soot or ash. "Do not open." It was written in jagged, uneven letters, and the wall around it was blackened, as if it had been burned. I checked the room behind the wall, but it was empty, just a storage closet filled with broken medical equipment. Still, I avoided that part of the building after that. The worst night came about 2 weeks into the job. It was around 3 a.m., the time when the building always felt the heaviest, like it was pressing down on you, suffocating you. I was walking through the East Wing, which was one of the more intact parts of the hospital, when my flashlight died. 1 second it was on, cutting through the darkness, and the next it was gone, plunging me into blackness. I fumbled with it, smacking it against my palm, but the light wouldn't come back. My phone was in my pocket, but when I pulled it out, the screen was dead, even though I'd charged it before the shift. That's when I heard it, breathing. It was faint at first, barely louder than the sound of my own heartbeat, but it was there, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere in the darkness. I turned, my hands shaking, but I couldn't see anything. The air felt colder, heavier, and the sound grew louder, closer. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet, and that's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just barely visible in the dim glow of a single emergency light, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, with arms that stretched down to the floor and legs that seemed to bend in the wrong places. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a featureless void, a blank expanse of pale flesh that seemed to pulse and shift like something alive. It didn't move. It didn't have to. The air around it seemed to hum, vibrating with a low, droning sound that crawled into my ears and settled in my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I just stood there, paralyzed, as the thing tilted its head like it was studying me. And then it took a step. The sound broke whatever spell had been holding me. I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding against the floor as the droning hum grew louder, more frantic. I didn't stop until I reached the security office, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My phone was working again, and I called the supervisor, begging him to send anyone, to get me out of there. He never answered. When I finally worked up the courage to leave, the building was silent. The figure was gone, and the halls were empty. But as I stepped outside into the cool night air, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were wet footprints on the ground, leading away from the hospital, and they were following me. Let's start a new story. I only noticed it because I'd been lying awake, scrolling mindlessly through my phone. My inbox pinged, and the notification popped up. From an sender. The subject line simply said, "Did you see?" I clicked it, more curious than concerned. The body of the email was empty except for a single link, the kind that looked like a jumble of random characters. It didn't lead to a website. When I clicked it, nothing happened. No error message, no redirect. Just a blank screen. It was weird, but I figured it was spam and forgot about it. The second email arrived the next night, at the exact same time. From an sender. Subject, look closer. This time, there was an attachment. I hesitated. Everyone knows not to open attachments from unknown senders. But the timestamp and the cryptic message, it felt personal, like someone was watching me. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The attachment was a photograph. At first, it didn't seem like much, a grainy black and white image of a street I didn't recognize. But as I looked closer, my heart began to pound. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long and a face I couldn't quite make out. The more I stared at it, the more it seemed to shift, like the pixels were alive. I deleted the email immediately. The third one came the following night. This time, the subject line said, "Why are you ignoring me?" There was no text, just another attachment. It was another photograph, but this one made my blood run cold. It was my street. The photo was taken at night, from a vantage point that looked like it was across the street from my apartment. The lights in my windows were on, and I could see the faint outline of my silhouette in one of the rooms. And there, standing in the shadows near the edge of the frame, was the figure again. It was closer now. I stared at the image for what felt like forever, my heart racing. My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I even say? Someone sent me a creepy photo? I locked every door and window in my apartment and spent the night wide awake, clutching a baseball bat. At 3:33 a.m. on the dot, my phone buzzed again. This time, the email was different. From an sender. Subject, it's inside. I dropped the phone. My hands shook as I scrambled to pick it up, rereading the subject line over and over, my brain refusing to process it. I checked the locks again, my pulse hammering in my ears. Everything was secure. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. But the email wasn't wrong. I felt it before I saw it. A shift in the air, a pressure that made the room feel smaller, heavier. Slowly I turned. The figure was there. It stood in the far corner of my living room, its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then, with a fluid, unnatural motion, it stepped closer. I bolted. I didn't grab my keys, my wallet, or even my shoes. I just ran, out the door and down the stairs, not stopping until I was outside on the street. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost didn't look, but curiosity got the better of me. Another email. From NO sender. Subject: why did you run? This one had a video attached. I was shaking as I opened it. The footage was from inside my apartment, filmed from the exact spot where I'd been standing moments ago. The camera was steady, as if placed on a tripod. In the video, I was still there, frozen in place, staring at the figure in the corner. But I didn't move. I didn't run. I just stood there as the figure crept closer, its limbs unfolding in ways that made my stomach churn. It reached me, and then the video ended. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it had closed up. I don't know how long I stood there, shaking, before I finally worked up the courage to go back inside. The apartment was empty. No figure. No strange presence. Just me and the suffocating silence. But when I checked my phone, there was one final email waiting for me. From NO sender. Subject: see you soon. That was 3 days ago. I haven't left my apartment since. I've unplugged my phone, my computer, everything electronic. But every night, at exactly 3:33 a.m., I hear the buzz of a notification. I don't know how it's getting through, and I don't know how long I can ignore it. Let's start a new story. I was walking home from a late shift, cutting through the woods to shave off some time. It was a shortcut I'd taken 100 times, a narrow dirt path snaking through the trees, lit only by the faint glow of my phone flashlight. The night was crisp, the kind of cold that bit at your cheeks but didn't seep into your bones. And then I heard it, a low, distant rumble. It started soft, like thunder rolling over the horizon, but grew louder with every step. I slowed, turning my light toward the trees. There were no train tracks in these woods. The nearest station was miles away. The rumble deepened, and a light flickered in the distance, faint, golden, and unnatural. I froze as the sound grew deafening, a cacophony of metal grinding against metal, echoing through the forest like a living thing. Then the train emerged. It came out of nowhere, cutting through the trees as if the world had folded around it. The locomotive was massive, its black iron surface glinting in the faint light. The windows were dark, their glass cracked and smeared with grime. It wasn't moving particularly fast, just coasting along, but its sheer size and presence were overwhelming. There were no tracks beneath it. It glided over the forest floor, hovering inches above the dirt, its wheels turning silently. I should have run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But something about the train held me in place. It wasn't just its size or its impossibility. It was the way it seemed to hum with awareness. The engine passed, followed by a series of rusted, ancient-looking cars. Some were passenger cars with curtains hanging limply in the windows. Others were boxcars, their sides dented and streaked with rust. One of the boxcars had a hole in its side, large enough for me to see inside. I wish I hadn't looked. The interior was filled with shadows that didn't make sense. They moved, writhing and shifting, like water disturbed by an unseen force. For a brief moment, I thought I saw faces in the darkness. Too many faces, all staring out at me. The train slowed as the caboose approached. It didn't stop, but it crawled to a near halt, the door to the final car creaking open. A staircase unfolded, leading down to the forest floor, as if inviting me aboard. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then the voice came. "Are you coming?" It wasn't loud. It wasn't even particularly threatening. But it carried weight, like it wasn't just asking me a question. It was offering me a choice I couldn't refuse. I turned toward the open door, my legs moving without my permission. I climbed the stairs, the cold metal vibrating faintly beneath my feet. The door shut behind me as soon as I stepped inside. The interior of the car was nothing like I'd expected. It was vast, impossibly vast, stretching farther than any train car should. The walls were covered in dark, polished wood, and the floor was lined with an ornate red carpet that smelled faintly of smoke and something metallic. Rows of benches stretched into the distance, and every seat was occupied. The passengers didn't look at me. They stared straight ahead, their faces blank and expressionless. They were dressed in all manner of clothing, some modern, some old-fashioned, some so outdated they looked like they belonged in a museum. I tried to speak, but no words came out. The train jerked, and I stumbled forward, gripping the back of a bench to steady myself. When I looked up, the passengers were staring at me. All of them. Hundreds of eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. Their faces remained still, their mouths unmoving, but their eyes were alive with something I couldn't understand. "Sit," the voice said. I turned to see a conductor standing at the far end of the car. He wore a crisp, black uniform with gold trim, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. His gloved hand extended toward an empty seat near the middle of the car. I didn't want to sit. Every fiber of my being told me not to sit, but my legs carried me forward anyway, and I slid into the seat as if I'd done it 100 times before. The train began to move again, picking up speed. The hum of the wheels filled the air, and the passengers returned their gazes to the windows, as if I no longer existed. I stared out my own window, but there was nothing outside. No trees, no forest, no stars. Just darkness. Time lost all meaning. The train rolled on, the hum of the wheels rhythmic and hypnotic. The passengers sat silently, their expressions never changing. I don't know how long I sat there before the door to the car creaked open again. A woman stepped in. She was young, dressed in a tattered hoodie and jeans, her face pale and streaked with dirt. Her eyes darted around the car, wide with fear, until they locked onto mine. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Before I could respond, the conductor appeared behind her. "You shouldn't have boarded," he said, his voice calm but heavy with finality. She tried to run, but the passengers were faster. Their heads snapped toward her, their faces suddenly alive with terrible, twisting expressions. Hands shot out, gripping her arms, her legs, her shoulders. She screamed as they pulled her down into the floor, the carpet rippling like water as she disappeared beneath it. The car fell silent again, and the passengers returned to their seats as if nothing had happened. The train didn't stop. The conductor walked past me without a word, disappearing into the next car. I stared out the window, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The darkness outside seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving in it. Something massive, with too many limbs and glowing, lidless eyes. Then the voice returned, soft and certain. "It's almost your stop. I don't know how I'm writing this. I don't even know if I'm still alive. But if you ever see a train in the middle of nowhere, don't get on. Because once you're aboard, it doesn't let you leave. And it knows where you're going." Let's start a new story. I wasn't sure why the door was locked. It was my first day at the new office. The building, an aging, monolithic structure with too many windows and a permanent chill, was the kind of place where time felt slower. The air smelled faintly of old paper and floor wax, and the narrow hallways seemed built to swallow sound. Still, the job was a step up from where I'd been, so I was trying to see the silver lining. The office I was assigned was at the end of the corridor on the 8th floor, a corner room I'd been told I'd share with a coworker named Erin. She wasn't there when I arrived. Her desk was empty, her chair slightly askew. But what caught my attention immediately was the door at the far end of the room. It was wooden, older than the rest of the office fixtures, with a tarnished brass handle and no label. Locked. I tried turning the knob out of curiosity, but it wouldn't budge. "Don't worry about that," a voice said behind me. I turned to see a man leaning in the doorway, holding a stack of folders. He had the look of someone who had worked here too long. Tired eyes, a crooked tie, a faint air of resignation. "That door hasn't opened in years," he said, walking past me to Erin's desk. "It's storage or something. Maintenance keeps it locked." I nodded, though something about the door nagged at me. There were no signs, no indication of what might be behind it. Just the faintest scuff marks on the floor, as if the door had been opened and shut many times before, and not gently. "Name's Mike," the man said, offering a hand. "Welcome to the team." I shook it and tried to focus on the awkward small talk that followed. But even as he explained the ins and outs of the office, my eyes kept drifting back to that door. The first few days passed without incident. The work was straightforward enough, and Erin turned out to be friendly but distant, the kind of person who knew everyone's name but never stayed late to chat. I asked her once about the door, and her reaction was immediate, a quick, nervous laugh as she waved it off. "Mike's right," she said. "It's just storage. Honestly, it's not worth thinking about." But that didn't stop me from thinking about it. It started small, little noises that came at odd times. A faint scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged, or a dull thud, as though something had fallen over. I glance up, expecting Erin to react, but she never seemed to hear it. One evening, when I was working late, the noise came again. Louder this time, a rhythmic tapping, slow and deliberate. I stood, my heart thudding in my chest, and walked toward the door. The tapping stopped as soon as I reached it. I pressed my ear to the wood, listening. Nothing. And then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it. A voice. It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. "Help me," it said. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. The office was empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, willing myself to move. When I finally did, I grabbed my bag and left without looking back. The next morning, I told myself it had been stress or exhaustion, my mind playing tricks on me. I almost convinced myself it wasn't real, until I saw the scratches. They were on the door now, long, jagged marks etched into the wood. I could feel the faint ridges under my fingers, as though something had clawed at the surface. I showed Erin, expecting her to react, but she just shook her head. "It's been like that forever," she said, not meeting my eyes. "You're overthinking it." But I wasn't. The noises grew worse over the next week. Louder, more frequent. Tapping, dragging, even faint whispers that would start and stop at random. No one else seemed to notice, and when I brought it up, I got the same dismissive responses. "Old building. Pipes. Don't let it get to you." One night, unable to take it anymore, I decided to stay late and figure out what was happening. I brought a crowbar from home, stuffing it into my bag and waiting until the office cleared out. By 9 p.m., I was alone. The door felt colder than before, the metal of the handle icy to the touch. I hesitated, my stomach twisting, but the whispers came again, urgent, pleading. "Please, open the door." I wedged the crowbar against the frame, bracing myself, and pried it open. The lock gave way with a sharp crack, the door swinging inward with a groan. Behind it was darkness. I shone my phone's flashlight into the space, expecting shelves or boxes. But the beam of light revealed only a staircase, spiraling downward into what looked like an impossible void. The air was damp, heavy, carrying a smell like wet earth and decay. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Down here." I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to shut the door and leave, to pretend I'd never opened it. But something compelled me forward, my feet moving as if I weren't in control. The stairs creaked under my weight, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. The further I descended, the colder it became, the air growing thick and suffocating. The light from my phone barely pierced the gloom, illuminating damp stone walls that seemed to pulse faintly, like they were alive. At the bottom of the stairs, I found the source of the whispers. It was a figure, hunched and shadowed, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its face was obscured, but its eyes were wide and empty, black pits that seemed to drink in the light. "Thank you," it said, its voice a rasping echo. "I've been waiting." I stumbled back, tripping over the uneven ground, but the figure didn't move. It just watched me, its head tilting slightly, as if studying me. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered. "But now, you can't leave." I turned and bolted up the stairs, my breath ragged. my pulse thundering in my ears. When I reached the top, I slammed the door shut and shoved a filing cabinet against it, my hands trembling. The office was silent, the whispers gone. The next morning, the door was locked again, the scratches gone. Erin acted like nothing had happened, her demeanor as calm and distant as ever. But when I looked into her eyes, I saw the same emptiness I'd seen in that figure. I don't work there anymore. I quit that same day, packed my things, and never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, and I know the door is still waiting. Let's start a new story. I just moved into a new apartment, a cozy one-bedroom in a complex that smelled faintly of fresh paint and detergent. It wasn't fancy, but it was quiet and cheap, a perfect fit for someone starting over after a messy breakup. The first few nights were uneventful, the usual routine of unpacking boxes, arguing with IKEA furniture, and pretending I could survive on takeout forever. Then, on the fourth night, I heard its soft scratching at my door. I froze mid-bite of a microwave burrito, straining to listen. The sound was faint, intermittent, like someone lightly running their fingernails over wood. My apartment was at the end of a long hallway with no reason for anyone to be passing by. Cautiously, I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. A cat sat there, staring back at me. It was an ordinary tabby, small and scruffy, with a thin frame that suggested it hadn't eaten well in a while. Its eyes were wide, glowing faintly in the dim hallway light. I opened the door a crack, and it immediately bolted inside, weaving between my legs before I could react. "Hey, wait!" I called after it, but the cat ignored me, darting straight to the couch and curling up like it had lived there for years. I sighed. I wasn't a cat person, but I wasn't heartless either. I figured it must belong to someone in the building, so I posted in the complex's online forum and left the door open for a while in case it wanted to leave. It didn't. Instead, it fell asleep, its little chest rising and falling with the kind of contentment I hadn't felt in months. By morning, no one had claimed the cat. I left the door open again, but it didn't budge. Eventually, I gave in and set out a bowl of water and some tuna, telling myself it was temporary. I'd take it to a shelter later if no one showed up. That night, the scratching started again. I was on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard its soft rhythmic coming from the door. The cat, which had been curled up on the armrest, perked up immediately, its ears swiveling toward the sound. "Is that another one of your friends?" I joked, but the cat didn't move. It just stared at the door, its body tense, tail flicking slightly. I got up and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. When I opened the door, there was nothing there. No people, no cats, not even the faintest trace of movement. I closed the door, double-locked it, and went to bed, chalking it up to apartment noises I wasn't used to yet. But the next night, the scratching came back, louder this time, more insistent. The cat reacted the same way, sitting perfectly still, staring at the door like it knew something I didn't. I flung the door open, expecting to catch some kid playing a prank, but the hallway was as empty as before. A cold draft slipped past me, raising goosebumps on my arms. I hesitated, then stepped out into the hall, looking both ways. Nothing. When I went back inside, the cat was gone. I searched the apartment, but it had vanished completely. The windows were closed, and I hadn't opened the door long enough for it to run out. Yet it wasn't there. I even checked behind the couch and in the tiny gap between the fridge and the wall, calling for it like it would answer. By morning, I convinced myself it had somehow slipped out when I wasn't looking. Cats were sneaky after all. But then, that evening, it came back. I was sitting at the kitchen table when I heard a soft thump behind me. I turned, and there it was sitting on the couch like it had never left. It looked exactly the same, thin, scruffy, with those wide, glowing eyes, but something about its presence made my stomach twist. I didn't remember hearing the door open. "Where have you been?" I asked, but the cat just blinked at me. The scratching returned that night, this time accompanied by a sound like faint breathing. I didn't look through the peephole. I didn't open the door. I just sat there, clutching a kitchen knife, while the cat watched the door with unblinking eyes. The noise went on for hours, stopping only when the first rays of dawn seeped through the curtains. Over the next few days, things escalated. The cat would disappear for hours at a time, only to reappear in places I knew it hadn't been before. Perched on the counter, hiding in the closet, once even inside the kitchen cabinet. The scratching at the door grew louder, more frantic, like whatever was out there was desperate to get in. One night, I heard whispering. It was faint, muffled just beyond the door. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but when I pressed my ear to the wood, I heard it clearly. My name, repeated over and over in a voice that wasn't quite human. "Lauren, let me in. Lauren, please." I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. The cat stared at me, its tail lashing, as if it was waiting to see what I would do. I didn't open the door. Instead, I grabbed my phone and called the building manager, begging them to check the security cameras. They agreed, though they sounded skeptical. The next morning, the manager called me back. "Miss, Lauren, right? You might want to come down here." I met him in his office, where he'd pulled up footage from the last few nights. The camera outside my door showed nothing. No one knocking, no one scratching. But the audio told a different story. The sounds were all there. The scratching, the breathing, the voice whispering my name. The manager looked pale. "I don't know what kind of prank this is, but it's disturbing." "It's not a prank," I said. "It's happening. Something is doing this." He didn't believe me, not fully, but he agreed to send a maintenance worker to inspect my apartment. They found nothing out of the ordinary, except for one thing, a loose floorboard in the living room. When they pried it up, I saw what was underneath. A small, empty space filled with tufts of matted fur, tiny bones, and a collar with a rusted tag. The name on the tag was unreadable, but the shape of the collar was unmistakable. It belonged to a cat. I moved out the next day, leaving the furniture, the deposit, and everything else behind. I don't know what was trying to get in, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I hear scratching at my door, faint and far away, as if it's still looking for me. Let's start a new story. Email arrived. The subject line was simple. "I need you to come home." No greeting, no sign-off, just a single sentence in the body of the email. It's about the attic. I stared at the screen, unease crawling under my skin. Our family house was the last place I wanted to be. After Dad died, Amelia and I had fought over everything. The estate, the funeral, even the tiniest details like who got to keep his watch. I moved to another city to avoid the fallout, leaving her to manage the house alone. We didn't talk after that. Until now. I thought about deleting the email, pretending I hadn't seen it. But the attic, that made me pause. When we were kids, the attic had terrified both of us. It wasn't just the usual creaks and groans of an old house. There was something about the space itself, a kind of presence that felt too aware of us. We avoided it as much as possible, even when Mom used to send us up there to fetch the Christmas decorations. Dad always kept it locked. He never explained why, and when we asked, he'd shrug and say, "Old houses have old secrets." The day after Dad died, Amelia told me she'd found the attic key. Now she wanted me to come back. I told myself it was a bad idea, that I was better off staying away. But the next morning, I found myself driving the 2 hours to the old house, the email still open on my phone like a bad omen. The house looked exactly as I remembered, weathered siding, shutters hanging slightly crooked, the garden overgrown with weeds. Amelia met me at the door. She looked tired, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun, shadows under her eyes. "Thanks for coming," she said, stepping aside to let me in. I nodded, unsure of what to say. The air inside was thick, stale, as if the house had been holding its breath. "Where's the key?" I asked, cutting to the chase. She hesitated, her fingers twitching like she wanted to wring her hands. Finally, she pulled a small, rusted key from her pocket. "It's already open," she said, her voice tight. That stopped me. "You opened it without me?" She glanced away, guilt flickering across her face. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "You'll see." The stairs creaked under our weight as we climbed to the second floor. The attic door was at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. I felt a prickle of unease. As kids, we used to joke that something lived behind that door, something patient waiting. Amelia pushed the door open, and I froze. The attic was just as I remembered it. dusty beams, old boxes stacked in uneven piles. But something was wrong. In the center of the room, the floorboards had been pulled up, revealing a dark, gaping hole. The edges of the wood were splintered, as though something had clawed its way out. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. "I didn't do it," Amelia said quickly. "I found it like this." I stepped closer, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The hole wasn't deep, maybe 3 or 4 feet, but what caught my attention were the markings inside. Symbols were carved into the dirt, looping and jagged, spiraling inward like a labyrinth. They didn't look random. They looked intentional. "Why didn't you call the cops?" I asked, my voice shaking. "They wouldn't understand," she said. "It's not normal, Daniel. Just look." She pointed to a corner of the attic, and my stomach turned. There was a pile of bones. Small ones, birds, rodents, something else I couldn't identify. They were arranged neatly, almost ritualistically, in concentric circles. "I started hearing noises last month," Amelia said. Her voice was quiet, barely audible over the pounding in my ears. "Scratching, knocking. I thought it was rats at first, but then things started moving." "Moving?" She nodded. "I'd come home, and the furniture would be in different places. Doors I'd locked would be open. I thought I was losing my mind. I turned back to the hole, dread pooling in my gut. "What's down there?" "I don't know," she whispered. "But it's been watching me." That was when I saw it. A shadow moved at the edge of the hole, so subtle I almost missed it. It wasn't the shadow of the beams or the boxes. It shifted against the light, independent, alive. "Do you see it?" Amelia's voice was tight, panicked. I nodded. We stepped back as the shadow stretched, spilling across the floor like ink. The air grew colder, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something metallic. "Close it," I said. Amelia shook her head. "I've tried," she said. "It won't stay closed." The shadow began to take shape, rising from the hole. It was human, or something close to human. Its limbs were too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its face was featureless, smooth and pale, except for its eyes. They burned like coals, staring straight at us. "Why did you come back?" it whispered, its voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. Amelia grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to go," she said. I didn't argue. We ran, the shadow spilling across the walls behind us. The attic door slammed shut as we bolted down the stairs. I didn't look back. We left the house that night, abandoning everything. The furniture, the memories, the fight over Dad's watch. None of it mattered anymore, but the shadow followed me. I see it in the corners of my apartment now, just beyond the edge of the light. I hear its voice in the quiet moments, whispering words I can't understand. And every night, I dream of the attic. The hole is deeper now, and something is still climbing out.